Before there was Greece, there was the sea, and the scattered islands that gave it form. The origins of Greek civilization lie in the distinctive geography of the Aegean basin, a region defined by fragmentation and connection in equal measure. The Greek mainland, shaped by mountain chains running northwest to southeast, was divided into small plains and valleys isolated from one another. To the east, the Aegean Sea, dotted with hundreds of islands, extended toward the coasts of Anatolia, linking Europe and Asia through maritime corridors. This landscape ensured that no single center could dominate the region easily, yet it also encouraged interaction, navigation, and exchange. Archaeological surveys across the Cyclades, Crete, and mainland Greece have confirmed that by the 5th millennium BCE, Neolithic communities had already established networks of trade, particularly in obsidian, a volcanic glass sourced from the island of Melos and found in settlements across the Aegean and Anatolia. The earliest agricultural communities in this region emerged around 6500 BCE, part of the broader Neolithic transition spreading from Anatolia into southeastern Europe. Excavations at Sesklo and Dimini in Thessaly reveal organized village life with rectangular mud brick houses, domesticated wheat and barley, and evidence of social differentiation in household sizes. These early settlements demonstrate that the Aegean world participated in the same Neolithic revolution that transformed the Near East, though on a smaller and more localized scale. The fertility of the Thessalian plain allowed early surplus production, while coastal and island sites relied heavily on fishing and maritime exchange. This ecological diversity produced the foundations of regional specialization that would characterize later Greek economic systems. By the late 4th millennium BCE, cultural developments accelerated in the Cycladic islands. Archaeologists categorize this period as the Early Bronze Age, ca. 3000 to 2000 BCE, marked by metallurgy, long-distance trade, and new forms of social organization. Burial evidence from cemeteries such as Calandriani on Syros suggests the emergence of status distinctions, indicated by finely crafted marble figurines and metal objects. These stylized human figures, once thought to be religious idols, are now interpreted as indicators of shared cultural identity across the islands rather than centralized religious symbols. Their standardized proportions and limited distribution suggest a society of small-scale elites connected through exchange rather than territorial authority. This pattern reflects a consistent feature of early Aegean society: complex interaction without political unification. The diffusion of metal technology into the Aegean coincided with growing contact with Anatolia and the Levant. Analyses of copper and tin sources indicate imports from regions as distant as Cyprus and central Anatolia, demonstrating that Aegean communities participated in the broader economic systems of the eastern Mediterranean. These trade routes introduced not only materials but also ideas, including early administrative practices and artistic motifs. At the site of Lerna in the Argolid, archaeologists uncovered the so-called House of Tiles, a monumental two-story structure built around 2500 BCE, with clay ceilings that imply record-keeping and controlled storage. Although the building was destroyed by fire, its scale and complexity suggest an early form of centralized administration, anticipating the palatial systems that would later define Minoan and Mycenaean states. Geography remained the determining factor in this development. Unlike the fertile river valleys of Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Aegean lacked broad floodplains and navigable rivers. Its fragmented terrain favored small, autonomous communities organized around kinship and local resources. Yet the sea acted as a unifying medium, providing both communication and sustenance. The distribution of similar pottery styles, tools, and burial practices across the islands points to sustained maritime contact rather than isolated evolution. This maritime orientation would later underpin the Greek conception of identity, one defined not by empire or landmass but by access to the sea. Interpretively, the interplay between isolation and connectivity shaped the Aegean's political trajectory. Because no region possessed overwhelming natural dominance, power was inherently decentralized. The mountains prevented the emergence of a single agricultural core, while the sea encouraged competition and cooperation through trade. This environmental fragmentation fostered adaptability and regional diversity, key traits that persisted throughout Greek history. Scholars often describe the Aegean as a fractured unity, a landscape in which shared culture coexisted with perpetual local autonomy. Archaeological discoveries also highlight the gradual shift from egalitarian villages to hierarchically organized settlements. At Manica in Euboea and Polyokne on Lemnos, stratified architecture and imported goods reveal the rise of elite control over production and exchange. Pottery typologies from these sites trace stylistic influence from both Anatolian and Cycladic traditions, confirming their intermediary position between major cultural zones. Radiocarbon dating places these developments in the mid-3rd millennium BCE, suggesting that maritime trade catalyzed social complexity before the appearance of palace economies. In effect, the Aegean's earliest political formations arose not from conquest, but from control of exchange. Evidence from seafaring technology reinforces this conclusion. Rock carvings and miniature boat models, such as those from the site of Aea Irene on Chia, depict advanced hull designs capable of long-distance travel. By 2500 BCE, Aegean mariners likely possessed the navigational skill to cross open waters regularly, linking the islands and mainland into a coherent cultural sphere. These maritime capabilities predate the rise of centralized states, indicating that trade networks and technological innovation preceded formal political institutions, an inversion of the pattern observed in many continental civilizations. Analytically, this period represents the formative stage of Greek civilization's systemic framework. Small-scale political autonomy balanced by shared economic and cultural networks. The Aegean world's geography imposed limits on territorial expansion but incentivized maritime integration. This structural tension between local independence and regional cohesion would remain a defining characteristic of Greek history, resurfacing in the later city-state system. The persistence of these early patterns underscores the environmental determinism that linked geography to governance. By the end of the early Bronze Age, around 2000 BCE, the Aegean region had developed multiple centers of complexity but no unified polity. Crete, with its fertile plains and strategic position along eastern Mediterranean trade routes, began to emerge as the most dynamic of these zones. Excavations at Knossos reveal continuity from Neolithic villages to monumental architecture, suggesting early consolidation under regional leadership. The archaeological shift from small communal dwellings to administrative complexes marks the threshold between village societies and organized states. As these early settlements matured into more centralized communities, Crete rose to prominence. From its palaces would emerge the first great civilization of the Aegean, the Minoans. In the Bronze Age Aegean, Crete ruled not by conquest but by commerce. Around 2000 BCE, the island of Crete emerged as the preeminent center of Aegean civilization. Its geographic position midway between the Greek mainland, the Near East, and Egypt made it a natural hub for maritime exchange. Archaeological surveys across the island reveal a transition from dispersed village communities to centralized urban complexes, most prominently at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros. These palaces, as Arthur Evans first termed them in the early 20th century, functioned not as royal residences in the Near Eastern sense but as administrative and economic centers. Their architecture, multi-storied, labyrinthine, and decorated with frescoes, testifies to both technical sophistication and institutional complexity. The rise of these palatial systems marks the beginning of the so-called Proto-Palatial period, ca. 1900 to 1700 BCE. At Knossos, excavations uncovered storerooms lined with massive pithoi, or storage jars, suggesting large-scale collection and redistribution of agricultural produce. Seal impressions and clay tablets, inscribed with the still undeciphered linear A script, indicate bureaucratic control over goods and labor. Archaeologists interpret this as evidence for a redistributive economy, in which agricultural surplus flowed into central storage and was allocated through administrative channels. This pattern aligns with contemporaneous systems in Egypt and Mesopotamia, though adapted to a maritime environment rather than a riverine one. Cretan society at this time displays little sign of militarization. Fortifications are notably absent from the palace sites, implying either a period of relative peace or the dominance of naval deterrence. The Minoan sphere of influence appears to have been secured through trade rather than conquest. Pottery bearing Cretan motifs has been found as far afield as the Levant, Cyprus, and the Nile Delta, while Egyptian objects, including scarabs and alabaster vessels, have been recovered from Cretan contexts. These exchanges confirm sustained contact with the major powers of the Eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian records from the reign of Thutmose III mention a land called Keftiu, generally identified with Crete, listed among the Aegean traders who brought luxury goods to the pharaonic court. The Minoan maritime system, often described as a thalassocracy, rested on control of sea routes and access to key harbors. The island's elongated shape, with natural anchorages along its northern coast, facilitated both coastal shipping and overseas expeditions. Archaeological finds of standardized weights, imported raw materials, and specialized workshops suggest an economy of high integration. Metalworking centers produced bronze tools and weapons for export, while artisans developed distinctive luxury goods, particularly fine ceramics and frescoed wall art, that circulated throughout the Aegean. The famous marine-style pottery of the late Minoan period, depicting octopuses and seaweed, reflects both artistic innovation and the centrality of maritime identity. Religious and cultural practices on Crete demonstrate continuity with earlier Aegean traditions but exhibit new complexity. Shrines and cult rooms within the palaces, as well as open-air peak sanctuaries on mountains such as Juctas, indicate a polycentric system of worship rather than a centralized priesthood. Figurines known as snake goddesses, found in the temple repositories of Knossos, have become emblematic of Minoan religion, though their precise role remains debated. Some scholars interpret them as representations of a mother goddess or fertility deity. Others view them as ritual attendants. What is certain is that ritual activity was integral to civic life. Frescoes from Knossos and Akrotiri depict processions, bull-leaping ceremonies, and scenes of communal participation, suggesting a social order in which performance and display reinforced political authority. Art and architecture reveal the Minoans' distinctive aesthetic principles. The palace's use of light wells, open courtyards, and colorful frescoes contrasts sharply with the defensive citadels of later Greek culture. Artists favored naturalistic themes, plants, animals, and marine life, rendered with dynamic curves and fluid motion. This visual language suggests a society that celebrated abundance and movement, consistent with its maritime orientation. While such imagery may appear decorative, it also conveyed ideological meaning. The harmony between human activity and the natural world, and perhaps the perceived benevolence of divine forces embodied in nature. Interpretively, Minoan civilization represents the first sustained experiment in complex administration without heavy militarization in the Aegean. The apparent absence of fortifications and the emphasis on economic and religious centralization indicate that social cohesion depended on shared participation in trade and ritual, not coercive power. This model demonstrates how insular geography and seaborne commerce could support state formation independent of territorial conquest. It also foreshadows later Greek patterns, decentralized political units bound by common culture rather than empire. The protopalatial system came to an abrupt end around 1700 BCE, when all major palace centers suffered destruction by fire or earthquake. Archaeological evidence suggests widespread rebuilding soon after, initiating the Neopalatial period, ca. 1700 to 1450 BCE. During this phase, Minoan architecture reached its peak complexity, with Knossos expanding to cover more than 2 hectares and containing an estimated 1,000 rooms. The administrative use of linear A continued, and new artistic forms appeared, including large-scale frescoes depicting ritual and courtly scenes. Trade intensified further, extending westward into the Cyclades and mainland Greece. One of the most significant events of this era was the eruption of the volcano on Thera, modern Santorini, dated by radiocarbon and ice core evidence to approximately 1600 BCE. The eruption was one of the largest in recorded prehistory, depositing ash across the eastern Mediterranean and generating tsunamis that reached the coasts of Crete. The settlement of Akrotiri, preserved under volcanic ash, provides unparalleled insight into Aegean life at the time. Multi-story houses with frescoed interiors, advanced plumbing, and evidence of literacy in Linear A. Scholars continue to debate the eruption's role in the decline of Minoan civilization. While it likely disrupted trade and caused coastal devastation, the archaeological record indicates that the palaces at Knossos and other sites remained active for several decades afterward. The final destruction of most centers around 1450 BCE appears instead to coincide with the expansion of Mycenaean power from mainland Greece. By the mid-15th century BCE, Linear A disappears from the archaeological record, replaced by Linear B, an early form of Greek, at Knossos. This transition marks the effective end of independent Minoan administration. Yet Minoan cultural forms persisted. Architectural layouts, religious symbols, and artistic motifs were adopted and adapted by the Mycenaeans. Thus, even as political control shifted, the foundations of Aegean civilization remained rooted in Cretan innovation. Analytically, the Minoan achievement demonstrates how maritime exchange could sustain a complex, literate society within a geographically constrained environment. The island's integration into interregional trade systems allowed accumulation of wealth without extensive territorial control. Its bureaucratic and artistic legacy provided the structural and cultural framework upon which later Greek civilization would build. The Minoan world, though ultimately supplanted, established the first enduring model of organized statehood in the Aegean, a system whose influence extended long beyond its decline. As Minoan influence waned, power shifted northward to the fortified citadels of the Mycenaeans. Stone citadels, gold masks, and the first Greek words ever written, the world of the Mycenaeans still echoes in myth. Around 1600 BCE, the balance of power in the Aegean shifted from Crete to the Greek mainland. Across the rugged landscapes of the Peloponnese, fortified citadels rose above fertile plains. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, and Orchomenos. Archaeology identifies these centers as the core of what modern scholarship terms Mycenaean civilization, a culture that would dominate the Aegean world for nearly 5 centuries. Excavations first conducted by Heinrich Schliemann in the 1870s revealed a society both wealthy and warlike. Its rulers buried beneath shafts filled with gold masks, inlaid weapons, and imported luxury goods. Although Schliemann sought the heroes of Homer, later research placed these discoveries firmly within the Late Bronze Age, ca. 1600 to 1100 BCE, a period of state formation, bureaucratic control, and extensive international contact. The Mycenaean citadels represent a distinct political and architectural form. Each was a heavily fortified compound, enclosed by massive cyclopean walls of limestone boulders, often exceeding 5 meters in thickness. Within these fortifications stood palatial complexes built around central courtyards, mirroring, and in many ways adapting, the Minoan architectural tradition. At Mycenae, the Megaron or Great Hall formed the political and ceremonial core of the palace, distinguished by its central hearth and throne room. Similar layouts appear at Pylos and Tiryns, indicating a shared administrative model across the mainland. The surrounding territories were organized into districts, with agricultural production, craft workshops, and religious shrines integrated into a centralized redistributive economy. The decipherment of the Linear B script in 1952 by Michael Ventris transformed understanding of Mycenaean society. These clay tablets, preserved by accidental baking in palace fires, record inventories, allocations, and religious offerings. Linguistic analysis revealed that the language was an early form of Greek, the earliest attested Indo-European language in the Aegean. The administrative content of the tablets indicates a hierarchical structure headed by a Wanex, king, supported by officials such as the Loagidas, leader of the people, and a network of scribes. This evidence situates the Mycenaean world within the broader pattern of Late Bronze Age palatial economies, akin to those of Hutti or Ugarit, though smaller in scale and more regionally fragmented. Archaeological finds at Pylos provide particularly detailed insight. Over 1,000 tablets from the Palace of Nestor record distributions of grain, textiles, livestock, and weapons. One set details preparations for coastal defense, listing chariot wheels and cuirasses, direct evidence of organized military planning. Tombs and grave goods reinforce this image of a warrior elite. Shaft graves from early Mycenae contain bronze swords with gold hilts, daggers inlaid with hunting scenes, and imported amber from the Baltic. Later, tholos or beehive tombs, such as the treasury of Atrus, demonstrate the monumental scale of elite burials. The material culture suggests a society in which status derived from both martial prowess and control over long-distance trade. Mycenaean trade networks extended across the eastern Mediterranean. Pottery bearing mainland motifs has been found in Cyprus, Egypt, and the Levant, while Near Eastern goods, including ivory, glass, and faience, reached the Aegean. This participation in interregional exchange brought both material wealth and cultural interaction. Linear bead tablets mention offerings to deities later known from classical Greek religion, including Zeus, Dios, Poseidon, Peres-Idio, and Hera, suggesting the continuity of religious vocabulary across millennia. At the same time, Mycenaean artisans adapted Minoan motifs into distinctly mainland styles. Frescoes featuring chariot scenes, hunting, and warfare replaced the fluid naturalism of earlier Cretan art. Interpretively, the Mycenaean world reflects the transformation of Aegean civilization from a mercantile to a militarized order. Whereas the Minoans relied on maritime exchange, the Mycenaeans consolidated power through fortified strongholds and hierarchical administration. The presence of standardized weights, taxation systems, and specialized production centers points to a proto-state structure. This pattern demonstrates how geography, with defensible highlands and limited arable land, encouraged regional kingdoms that competed yet shared cultural and linguistic unity. The enduring association of Mycenae with Homeric legend arises from later Greek memory of this Bronze Age era. In the Iliad and Odyssey, the heroes Agamemnon of Mycenae, Nestor of Pylos, and Odysseus of Ithaca appear as rulers of powerful, independent kingdoms bound by fragile alliances. Archaeology supports elements of this depiction. The citadels correspond to those named in the epic Catalogue of Ships, and the material record affirms an elite warrior culture. Yet scholars caution against literal correlation. The linear bead tablets lack any record of the Trojan War, and the scale of Mycenaean warfare appears regional rather than pan-Aegean. The Age of Heroes, therefore, represents not a historical epoch but a cultural memory, the poetic echo of a society already long vanished by Homer's time. By the 13th century BCE, the Mycenaean palatial system reached its zenith. Massive fortifications were expanded, and administrative activity intensified. At Pylos, tablets from the final years record the mobilization of forces and distribution of bronze for weaponry, suggesting external threat. Around 1200 BCE, however, this complex world began to unravel. Within a few decades, all major palaces were destroyed or abandoned. Linear bead writing disappeared, craft production declined, and long-distance trade collapsed. The causes remain debated. Theories range from invasions by the so-called Sea Peoples, to internal rebellion, to systemic failure within the wider Eastern Mediterranean network. Archaeological layers at Mycenae and Tiryns show evidence of fire and sudden destruction, while settlement surveys reveal a marked population contraction across the mainland. Interpretively, the collapse of the Mycenaean system exemplifies the fragility of highly centralized economies dependent on elite control and external exchange. The disruption of trade routes and the loss of bureaucratic administration dismantled the redistributive foundation upon which palatial authority rested. Yet the cultural legacy of Mycenaean Greece endured. Oral traditions preserved in epic poetry maintained memory of its kings and wars, transmitting fragments of Bronze Age social order into later Greek identity. By 1100 BCE, organized palace life in the Aegean had ended. The surviving population dispersed into smaller, self-sufficient communities. Literacy vanished, and monumental architecture ceased. The interconnected world of the Bronze Age dissolved, leaving only ruins and remembrance. With the fall of the Mycenaean palaces, Greece entered a long silence the centuries historians call the Dark Age. For nearly 4 centuries, the palaces fell silent, but the people endured. After the destruction of the Mycenaean palaces around 1200 BCE, the Aegean world entered one of the most obscure periods in ancient history. Archaeologists describe this phase, lasting from roughly 1100 to 750 BCE, as the Greek Dark Age, a term denoting not total collapse, but the absence of monumental architecture, literacy, and centralized administration that had characterized the Late Bronze Age. The once complex palace economies of Mycenae, Pylos, and Thebes disintegrated, leaving behind scattered rural settlements. Linear writing vanished, trade diminished, and the elaborate craftsmanship of the preceding centuries gave way to simpler, local production. Yet, beneath this apparent decline, evidence suggests adaptation rather than disappearance. Communities reorganized at a smaller scale, preserving essential social and religious practices even as large-scale political systems fell away. Archaeological layers across the mainland illustrate this contraction vividly. At sites like Tiryns and Mycenae, burned palace ruins were occasionally reoccupied by modest dwellings, a sign that the population did not abandon the landscape entirely. In some regions, such as Attica and parts of Crete, habitation continued uninterrupted, albeit in reduced form. Settlement surveys indicate a steep population drop, perhaps as much as 70% in some areas, followed by gradual recovery after 1000 BCE. Cemeteries became smaller and simpler. Shaft and tholos burials were replaced by inhumations or cremations in plain pits, often accompanied by a few ceramic vessels rather than gold and weaponry. These changes mark not cultural extinction, but the recalibration of society towards subsistence economies based on household agriculture and herding. Material culture from this era, primarily pottery, provides the most reliable evidence for continuity. The proto-geometric style, emerging around 1050 BCE, introduced precision in decoration through the use of the potter's compass and controlled geometric motifs. Though austere compared to Mycenaean art, it demonstrates technical refinement and regional variation. Distribution patterns of proto-geometric ceramics reveal networks of exchange among surviving communities, particularly in Attica, Euboea, and the Aegean Islands. This suggests that even in isolation, local artisans maintained contact and competition, seeding the artistic revival that would later culminate in the full geometric style of the 9th century BCE. The disappearance of writing after the fall of the palaces represents a critical rupture in Greek history. The linear administrative system, tied directly to palace bureaucracy, ceased entirely, and for 4 centuries no new script appeared. This loss of literacy marks the end of centralized record-keeping and state-level redistribution. Yet oral tradition flourished in its place. Epic poetry, transmitted through performance, preserved fragments of Bronze Age memory, including the deeds of kings and the pantheon of gods. Modern scholars identify this continuity as a crucial cultural bridge. While written history vanished, the collective memory of heroic and divine narratives ensured that the Greek language and mythic imagination persisted unbroken. Religious practices during the Dark Age reveal similar resilience. Archaeological finds at sanctuaries such as Lefkandi, Kalapodi, and Drairos demonstrate ongoing ritual activity throughout the period. Offerings of figurines, weapons, and pottery to deities like Zeus and Hera indicate continuity from Mycenaean cult traditions. At Lefkandi on Euboea, one of the most significant sites of the era, excavations uncovered a monumental apsidal structure dating to the 10th century BCE, possibly a hero shrine or elite residence. Within it, archaeologists found a pair of burials accompanied by rich grave goods, including imported faience and bronze, as well as the cremated remains of horses. The scale and symbolism suggest the persistence of hierarchical display and ancestral veneration, even in an age of general poverty. The economy of the Dark Age was primarily local, built upon kinship-based landholding and small-scale agriculture. Without palatial redistribution, households became the basic unit of production. Barley, olives, and grapes continued as staples, while animal husbandry, particularly sheep and goats, provided subsistence and trade commodities. Evidence from sites such as Nicoria in Messenia shows self-sufficient farming communities organized around family clusters. The absence of monumental storage facilities or administrative centers implies decentralized governance, though local elites may have retained influence through control of land and religious functions. Over time, limited trade reemerged, connecting Greece with Cyprus and the Levant by the late 10th century BCE. Finds of Near Eastern goods, such as bronze and ivory, attest to renewed maritime contact, foreshadowing the revival of commerce in the ensuing centuries. Interpretively, the Greek Dark Age demonstrates the capacity of complex societies to survive systemic collapse through social adaptation. The end of centralized administration did not erase cultural identity. Instead, it localized it. Communities drew strength from continuity in language, religion, and kinship structure. The reduction in scale, while dramatic, created the conditions for later political innovation. Without palatial dominance, smaller settlements developed mechanisms of communal decision-making and defense, precursors to the participatory institutions of the early polis. In this sense, the Dark Age was not merely a period of regression but a formative interval of decentralization and cultural consolidation. By the 9th century BCE, signs of recovery became unmistakable. Population levels began to rise, as evidenced by expanded cemeteries and new settlements in coastal regions. The appearance of iron tools and weapons marks a technological transition that reduced dependence on imported bronze. Artistic experimentation increased, with the geometric style reflecting both continuity and renewal. The reemergence of long-distance trade, particularly from Euboea and Crete, reconnected Greece to the eastern Mediterranean. Out of these local communities would emerge something entirely new, the polis, the city-state that would redefine Greek identity and political life. As ships once again cut across the Aegean, Greece began to rediscover its voice. After centuries of isolation and subsistence, the Greek world began to recover around the late 10th and 9th centuries BCE. Archaeological, technological, and demographic indicators all point to a gradual but unmistakable revival. The introduction of iron metallurgy transformed tools, weapons, and agricultural productivity. Settlements expanded in size and number, and trade networks once again linked the Aegean to the broader Mediterranean system. By 900 BCE, Greece was no longer a fragmented landscape of isolated villages, but a region on the cusp of renewed connectivity and cultural synthesis. This period, sometimes called the Early Iron Age, laid the material and intellectual foundations for the classical civilization that would follow. The technological shift from bronze to iron stands at the core of this transformation. Iron smelting, though more complex than bronze production, relied on materials widely available across the Greek mainland. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Lefkandi, Knossos, and Athens indicates local ironworking by the late 10th century BCE. The proliferation of iron sickles, spearheads, and knives in burial contexts suggests its widespread adoption in both agriculture and warfare. This metallurgical change democratized access to durable tools and weapons, reducing dependence on imported tin and copper. The resulting agricultural surplus supported population growth, while improvements in weaponry strengthened local defense and competition. Settlement expansion during this era is visible across the Aegean. Excavations at Zagora on Andros, Smyrna in Ionia, and Nicoria in Messenia reveal communities organized around planned streets, fortifications, and communal sanctuaries, early indicators of urban organization. Burial evidence shows increasing social differentiation, with grave goods including imported ornaments, iron weapons, and finely decorated pottery. These markers point to the reemergence of local elites who managed production and trade. By 850 BCE, the population of Greece had risen significantly from its post-collapse low, leading to demographic pressure on limited arable land. This growth would soon drive one of the most consequential movements in Greek history: overseas colonization. Between the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, Greek seafarers began to establish new settlements beyond the Aegean basin. Initially, colonization was concentrated in the eastern Mediterranean, particularly along the coast of Asia Minor, the region known as Ionia. Cities such as Miletus, Ephesus, and Smyrna emerged as centers of trade and cultural exchange between Greek settlers and Anatolian populations. These Ionian communities became the conduits through which Near Eastern technologies, artistic motifs, and intellectual traditions entered Greece. According to later genealogies, many of these cities trace their foundations to migrations from the mainland following the collapse of the palatial world, suggesting both continuity and expansion. By the late 8th century BCE, colonization extended westward. Greek settlers founded cities across the central and western Mediterranean. Pithecusae on the island of Ischia, ca. 770 BCE, and Cumae in Italy became the first permanent Greek outposts in the west, followed soon after by Syracuse, Naxos, and Leontini in Sicily. These colonies served multiple purposes: relieving population pressure, securing access to metal resources, and facilitating trade routes. Archaeological evidence from these sites, including pottery from Euboea and Corinth, demonstrates the scale of maritime connectivity. The spread of Greek material culture, geometric pottery, domestic architecture, and sanctuaries dedicated to Olympian gods signaled not imperial expansion but the diffusion of shared language and custom. At the same time, interaction with the Phoenicians, the foremost maritime traders of the age, introduced Greece to a transformative innovation: alphabetic writing. Sometime around 800 BCE, Greek merchants and artisans adapted the Phoenician consonantal script to the phonetic needs of the Greek language by adding distinct symbols for vowel sounds. This modification produced the first true alphabet in world history. The earliest known Greek inscriptions, such as the Dipylon in Akoi from Athens and the Cup of Nestor from Pithecusae, date to around 740 BCE. Both are informal, written in hexameter verse, suggesting that literacy initially served personal or artistic expression rather than bureaucracy. The adoption of writing marked a profound cultural shift. Oral tradition could now be recorded, preserved, and transmitted across generations. The renewed contact between Greece and the Near East during this period also enriched artistic and religious expression. Archaeologists refer to this influx of foreign influence as the Orientalizing period, ca. 750 to 700 BCE. Greek artisans incorporated motifs from Phoenician, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian art, such as sphinxes, griffins, and lotus flowers, into pottery, sculpture, and metalwork. These motifs did not replace Greek styles, but blended with local traditions to create a distinctive visual vocabulary. The same cross-cultural contact introduced new technologies in shipbuilding and metal casting, as well as new conceptions of divinity and cosmology that would shape early Greek philosophy. Perhaps the most enduring consequence of the Iron Age revival was the preservation and codification of epic poetry. The Iliad and the Odyssey, attributed to Homer, were composed during this era, most likely between 750 and 700 BCE. While rooted in oral tradition, their written form was made possible by the newly adopted alphabet. These epics encapsulated collective memory of the Bronze Age, offering models of heroism, governance, and divine order. Scholars interpret them as both literature and historical document, reflecting the social values, regional rivalries, and aristocratic ethos of the early Iron Age. The Homeric epics unified the fragmented Greek world through shared mythic heritage, fostering a sense of linguistic and cultural identity that transcended geography. Interpretively, the Iron Age revival illustrates how technological adaptation and maritime enterprise can reconstruct a civilization from fragmentation. The transition to iron economy, the recovery of trade, and the diffusion of population through colonization each played complementary roles in reestablishing connectivity. These developments reveal a society capable of dynamic response to geographic and demographic constraints. The Greeks, drawing from both internal resilience and external contact, transformed their fragmented villages into an interconnected cultural network. By 750 BCE, the Aegean had rejoined the Mediterranean world as a vibrant participant in trade and cultural exchange. Greek pottery reached North Africa, the Levant, and Italy. Eastern luxury goods flowed into mainland sanctuaries. alphabetic literacy spread quickly, enabling record-keeping, poetry, and eventually political documentation. The stage was set for a new institutional form, one that balanced community, citizenship, and collective governance. With literacy and contact restored, political innovation followed, the rise of the city-state, the polis that would define Greek civilization. By the 8th century BCE, the Greek world was no longer ruled by kings, but by citizens. By the end of the 8th century BCE, the social and political landscape of Greece had transformed beyond recognition. The palace-based monarchies of the Bronze Age were gone, replaced by a new form of collective organization, the polis, or city-state. The polis was not merely a city in the physical sense but a community of citizens bound by shared laws, cults, and institutions. It represented the culmination of centuries of decentralization, population recovery, and social experimentation. Each polis combined an urban center, the asti, with surrounding agricultural territory, the chora. Together, these formed a self-sufficient political and economic unit. The emergence of the polis marked the beginning of Greek political consciousness, a shift from kinship-based rule toward citizenship, from palatial authority to communal governance. Archaeological evidence traces the early development of the polis to processes of synoecism, the unification of scattered villages into centralized communities. In regions such as Attica, this process was gradual and largely peaceful. Tradition credited Theseus with the synoecism of Attica, but in historical terms, the unification of local settlements around Athens likely occurred during the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, as population growth and economic integration encouraged cooperation. In other areas, such as Sparta and Corinth, unification may have followed conquest or alliance. Synoecism created both political cohesion and economic interdependence, enabling communities to organize collective defense, regulate agriculture, and develop shared religious sanctuaries. The rise of the polis coincided with the spread of a new mode of warfare, the hoplite phalanx. By the early 7th century BCE, Greek warfare had evolved from aristocratic duels to massed infantry formations composed of citizen soldiers. Each hoplite, heavily armed with shield, spear, and helmet, fought as part of a disciplined line. Success depended not on individual prowess but on cohesion and mutual trust. This tactical transformation had profound social implications. The hoplite class, drawn from landowning farmers who could afford their own armor, became a political force within their communities. Collective military service fostered a sense of equality and mutual obligation among citizens, reinforcing the ideals of participation and shared responsibility that underpinned the polis. Political authority within the polis developed along aristocratic lines. The early city-states were typically governed by councils of nobles, who claimed descent from heroic ancestors and monopolized land ownership. In Athens, the hereditary kingship, basileus, gave way to the rule of archons, annually elected magistrates drawn from the aristocracy. In Corinth, power concentrated under the Bacchiad family, a lineage of noble rulers who controlled both politics and commerce. In Sparta, a unique dual kingship coexisted with a council of elders, Gerousia, and an assembly of male citizens, Apella, forming a mixed constitution that balanced monarchy, oligarchy, and communal participation. Despite their differences, all early polis shared a commitment to law, nomos, and civic identity, distinguishing citizen from foreigner, free man from slave. Religious institutions played a crucial role in defining the polis. Shared cults and festivals provided the spiritual framework for civic unity. The Acropolis, typically situated on an elevated plateau, functioned as both a sanctuary and a symbol of communal identity. In Athens, the cult of Athena Polias embodied the city's self-conception as a protector and center of wisdom. In Corinth, temples dedicated to Aphrodite and Apollo marked its position as a maritime crossroads. In Sparta, the worship of Artemis Orthia and Apollo Amycleos reflected both martial and local traditions. These cults were not merely religious but political, reinforcing the legitimacy of civic institutions and the cohesion of the citizen body. Economically, the polis system fostered self-sufficiency and specialization. Each city-state managed its own agricultural hinterland, producing grain, olives, and wine for domestic use and export. The reemergence of coinage in the late 8th century BCE, likely first in Asia Minor and later on the mainland, facilitated trade and taxation. Port cities such as Corinth and Chalcis became centers of craftsmanship and commerce, distributing pottery and metal goods throughout the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, the proliferation of colonies extended the reach of individual polis, securing resources and markets abroad while maintaining cultural ties with the mother city, metropolis. The evolution of governance within the polis illustrates the balance between tradition and innovation. Aristocratic dominance, though stable in the short term, contained the seeds of tension. As populations grew and wealth diversified through trade, non-aristocratic citizens demanded greater participation in decision-making. This gradual pressure set the stage for later reforms, such as those of Solon in Athens and the Lycurgan system in Sparta, but the underlying principle of collective identity had already taken root. The polis created a political vocabulary that emphasized public deliberation, civic duty, and the rule of law, concepts that would later define Greek political thought and, by extension, Western political theory. From a broader perspective, the formation of the polis reflects the interplay of geography, economy, and military organization. Greece's fragmented terrain, mountains dividing valleys and coastal plains, naturally produced small, autonomous communities rather than a unified state. Yet maritime contact ensured cultural coherence. The polis was thus a structural compromise, politically independent but culturally interconnected. The shared language, religion, and heroic tradition of the Greeks bound these small states into a common civilization, while their autonomy encouraged diversity and innovation. By the close of the 8th century BCE, the polis had become the dominant form of Greek political life. Athens, Sparta, and Corinth stood as early exemplars, each embodying a distinct path of development. Athens through gradual unification and civic reform, Sparta through militarization and social discipline, Corinth through mercantile wealth and oligarchic stability. Together they represented variations on a single institutional model, one that fused military cooperation, economic interdependence, and political participation into a durable social framework. These new political orders would soon produce both conflict and creativity on an unprecedented scale. Across Greece, reformers and tyrants reshaped power, forging new rules for citizenship and law. Between the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, the political landscape of Greece entered a period of profound experimentation. The polis, once dominated by aristocratic councils, faced growing pressures from economic diversification, population expansion, and the rising assertiveness of non-noble citizens. New wealth from trade, craftsmanship, and colonization challenged the hereditary privileges of the landed elite. In response, city-states across the Aegean developed varied mechanisms to mediate internal tensions: codified law, reform legislation, and, in many cases, tyranny. Far from representing chaos, these developments were instruments of adaptation, efforts to reconcile social change with civic order. The earliest codifications of law emerged from the need to replace customary justice, administered by aristocrats, with standardized procedures. In Draco's Athens, traditionally 621 BCE, this process reached its first formal expression. Draco's laws, inscribed on wooden tablets and displayed publicly, imposed severe penalties for even minor offenses. While the harshness of these measures became proverbial, giving rise to the term draconian, their significance lay in principle, not punishment. By placing legal authority in written form, Draco limited the discretion of noble judges and established the precedent of accountability to codified norms. Archaeological fragments of the draconian homicide law, preserved in later inscriptions, suggest an effort to regulate vengeance and introduce civic adjudication, marking a step toward impersonal justice. In the following century, Athens witnessed a more ambitious reordering under Solon, Archon in 594 BCE. Tasked with resolving mounting conflict between debt-ridden farmers and the aristocracy, Solon implemented a comprehensive reform program known as the Sysacthia, or shaking off of burdens. He abolished debt slavery, liberated those enslaved for debt, and restructured property classes according to agricultural yield, thereby linking political participation to wealth rather than lineage. Solon also reorganized the ecclesia, citizen assembly, and established new judicial institutions such as the Heliaea, permitting broader civic engagement in governance. While his reforms did not eliminate inequality, they created a flexible framework capable of accommodating economic change and expanding civic participation. Solon's legislation illustrates a wider archaic trend, the emergence of lawgivers, nomothetai, as mediators between competing social orders. In most cases, these reformers operated under temporary extraordinary powers, bridging the gap between oligarchy and democracy. Their authority rested on consensus rather than coercion. Similar figures appeared across the Greek world. Zaleucus of Locri in southern Italy, credited with introducing written codes, and Charondas of Catan in Sicily, known for procedural innovations in legal accountability. Such codifications reflect a collective movement toward institutionalization, as oral traditions gave way to stable civic frameworks that define citizenship, property, and justice. Parallel to these developments, many polis underwent phases of tyranny. One-man rule established outside traditional aristocratic channels but often maintained with popular support. The Greek tyrannos originally lacked the negative connotation it later acquired. It described a ruler who seized power irregularly but governed effectively. In Corinth, Cypselus overthrew the Bacchiad oligarchy around 657 BCE, redistributing land and promoting commerce. His son Periander continued these policies, transforming Corinth into a hub of Mediterranean trade and cultural patronage. In Sicyon, Cleisthenes pursued anti-aristocratic reforms and reorganized tribal structures, reducing noble influence. Across Ionia, Polycrates of Samos exemplified the maritime tyrant, commanding fleets, fortifying harbors, and fostering artistic production. Tyranny functioned as both a symptom and a solution to social strain. As wealth and population expanded, the inability of oligarchic institutions to incorporate new stakeholders led ambitious individuals, often from the fringes of the elite, to seize authority. Tyrants typically relied on mercenary forces, alliances with non-noble classes, and economic programs that benefited artisans and traders. Archaeological evidence, including monumental architecture such as Corinth's early stone temples and Samian harbors, attests to the prosperity and infrastructural investment associated with these regimes. Although tyrannies seldom endured beyond a generation or two, they stabilized states in transition, centralized administration, and prepared the ground for more inclusive political systems. While Athens and Corinth exemplified different responses to internal tension, Sparta followed an entirely distinct trajectory. According to later tradition, the Spartan constitution was the work of Lycurgus, a semi-legendary lawgiver whose reforms established the framework of Spartan society. Modern scholars place the consolidation of this system in the late 8th or early 7th century BCE. The Great Retra, preserved in fragmentary form by Plutarch, outlined a mixed constitution balancing monarchy, oligarchy, and communal participation. Two hereditary kings commanded armies. The Gerousia, a council of elders, proposed legislation, and the Apella, an assembly of male citizens, held limited voting power. The system emphasized stability, discipline, and equality among the homoioi, peers, sustained by a rigid social hierarchy and the subjugation of the Helots, an enslaved population of conquered Messenians. Sparta's institutions reflected a deliberate attempt to insulate society from internal division. The agoge, or state-controlled education system, trained citizens for collective military service, while common messes, syssitia, fostered solidarity among the elite. Economic simplicity, enforced by restrictions on luxury and foreign travel, preserved social cohesion at the cost of flexibility. This model stood in contrast to the commercial dynamism of other polis, yet it achieved remarkable longevity. The Spartan constitution, though rigid, embodied the archaic Greek fascination with balance, a political equilibrium between monarchy and democracy, law and discipline. The archaic period's political experimentation produced a spectrum of outcomes, but a shared purpose underlay them all: the creation of enduring institutions capable of mediating conflict and organizing citizenship. From written law to temporary tyranny, from reforming archons to rigid constitutions, Greek communities sought to translate social complexity into stable governance. These experiments established the fundamental categories of Greek political thought: isonomia, equality before the law; eunomia, good order; and demos, the people, that would later shape the democratic revolutions of the classical age. These internal experiments prepared Greece for a collective challenge. Persia. While cities competed, shrines united, in stone and ritual, Greece began to recognize itself. During the Archaic Age, as Greece remained politically fragmented into hundreds of autonomous polis, a parallel process unfolded: the formation of a shared cultural identity that transcended local boundaries. This identity, known as Pan-Hellenism, did not arise from centralized authority or imperial conquest, but from common language, religion, and ritual. Through sanctuaries, festivals, and games, Greek communities forged institutions of unity that balanced the fierce independence of their cities with a growing sense of collective belonging. Central to this development were the Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries, most notably Delphi, Olympia, Delos, and Isthmia. These sites occupied neutral territories between competing states and became spaces of both worship and diplomacy. Archaeological evidence from the 8th and 7th centuries BCE votive offerings, temple foundations, and inscribed dedications marks their rapid rise as centers of regional convergence. They offered what political structures could not: continuity, legitimacy, and communication across an otherwise divided landscape. The sanctuaries thus served as the first federal spaces of Greek civilization, where shared myth and ritual established a framework for cultural coherence. Among them, Olympia in the western Peloponnese emerged as the earliest and most enduring. Excavations reveal a continuous sequence of offerings dating back to ca. 1000 BCE, but it was around 776 BCE, the traditional date of the first Olympic Games, that Olympia's importance expanded beyond the local. Dedicated to Zeus Olympios, the site hosted athletic competitions held every 4 years, drawing participants from across the Greek world. Events such as the stadion, foot race, pentathlon, and wrestling celebrated physical excellence, arete, as a civic and moral virtue. Victory was not rewarded with material gain but with symbolic honor, the olive wreath or kotinos. The Olympic festival served several systemic purposes. First, it provided a ritualized mechanism of peaceful interaction. During the sacred truce, ekikyria, warfare was suspended to ensure safe passage for athletes and spectators. This recurring peace, though temporary, fostered diplomatic exchange and cultural familiarity among rival polis. Second, the games reinforced shared ideals of discipline, competition, and excellence, virtues equally prized in civic and military life. Inscriptions on victor statues, such as that of the 6th century runner Diagoras of Rhodes, commemorate not just personal achievement but communal identity. Each athlete's home city was publicly proclaimed, transforming individual triumph into civic prestige. Parallel to Olympia's athletic focus stood Delphi, the preeminent spiritual and intellectual hub of the Greek world. Situated on the slopes of Mount Parnassus and dedicated to Apollo, Delphi's influence derived from its oracle, the Pythia, whose cryptic pronouncements shaped decision-making across centuries. Archaeological layers at the sanctuary of Apollo reveal continuous development from the 8th century BCE, with monumental treasuries built by polis such as Athens, Corinth, and Sipnos, tangible displays of piety and wealth. Inscriptions record that envoys, or theoroi, consulted the oracle on matters of colonization, warfare, and law. The responses of the Pythia, interpreted by priests and recorded in verse, often reflected the political logic of the time. Ambiguous yet authoritative, ensuring the oracle's enduring prestige. Delphi also functioned as a repository of collective memory. Through the dedication of arms, statues, and architectural monuments, states inscribed their achievements into the sacred landscape. The Delphic Amphictyony, a league of neighboring tribes responsible for the sanctuary's administration, provided a precedent for cooperative governance. Over time, its model of shared custodianship, where diverse states contributed resources and maintained the sanctuary's sanctity, would influence later alliances such as the Delian League and Amphictyonic councils of the classical period. Other sanctuaries contributed to this emerging network. On the island of Delos, sacred to Apollo and Artemis, ritual gatherings blended religious devotion with maritime exchange. In Isthmia, near Corinth, games dedicated to Poseidon drew both Peloponnesian and Aegean participants. Each site maintained its local traditions yet operated within a recognizable pan-Hellenic framework, common deities, similar festival calendars, and standardized rituals. The dedications recovered from these sanctuaries, bronze tripods, inscribed plaques, and imported luxury goods, demonstrate the integration of religious and economic circuits. Trade and devotion reinforced one another, as sanctuaries became nodes linking Greece to Egypt, Phoenicia, and the Western Mediterranean. The artistic and literary expressions of the 7th and 6th centuries BCE further consolidated this shared identity. The Homeric epics, likely crystallized during this period, provided a mythological foundation that united Greeks under common heroic ancestors. In temples, sculptural programs depicted scenes from these epics, the deeds of Heracles, Perseus, or Achilles, transforming myth into civic iconography. Vase painters and poets drew from the same symbolic vocabulary, producing a recognizable aesthetic that transcended dialect and geography. This standardization of mythic language reflected an expanding communicative horizon. Greeks across the Aegean could recognize themselves in a shared narrative of origins and values. From an analytical perspective, Panhellenism was not the negation of local identity but its structural complement. The polis remained the basic political unit, but shared sanctuaries and festivals created ritualized arenas of cooperation that mitigated the fragmentation inherent in the system. The sanctuaries functioned as cultural regulators, providing legitimacy, continuity, and opportunities for diplomacy. Records indicate that treaties were sometimes deposited in temples, and disputes between states occasionally mediated by oracular authority, early forms of what modern scholars identify as religious arbitration. By the late 6th century BCE, the network of Pan-Hellenic centers had established a cultural infrastructure that allowed the idea of Hellenes to exist alongside Dorians, Ionians, and Aeolians. This sense of shared identity would later acquire political urgency under external pressure. The sanctuaries that once served as spaces of ritual encounter would soon become rallying points for collective defense. As unity of culture grew, external threats would soon force unity of arms. Greek ships carried more than goods, they carried a civilization. By the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Greek populations had expanded beyond the Aegean basin. Population growth, combined with limited arable land and social pressures, encouraged the establishment of colonies throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. This Greek expansion was not imperial in the modern sense. It relied on negotiation, settlement, and trade rather than conquest. Colonization allowed city-states to relieve demographic pressure, secure access to resources, and create commercial networks, while preserving cultural ties with the mother city or metropolis. Westward expansion led to the formation of Magna Graecia, the Greek territories of southern Italy and Sicily. The earliest settlements, such as Pithecusae on Ischia, ca. 770 BCE, and Cumae on the Campanian coast, ca. 750 BCE, served both strategic and economic purposes. They controlled maritime routes and accessed fertile plains suitable for cereals, olives, and vineyards. Archaeological evidence, including pottery imported from Euboea and Corinth, shows a deliberate transplantation of mainland Greek material culture. Settlers brought not only their language, religious practices, and art, but also social institutions such as the assembly, ecclesia, and law codes, laying the foundation for urban autonomy abroad. In Sicily, colonization followed similar patterns. Naxos, 734 BCE, Syracuse, 733 BCE, and Leontini were established along coastal plains, often interacting with indigenous populations such as the Sicels and Elymians. Excavated urban layouts reveal planned street grids, central sanctuaries, and fortifications adapted to local conditions. Greek temples, often Doric in style, served as both religious centers and markers of civic identity. Trade flourished alongside these settlements. Pottery, metalwork, and olive oil flowed outward, while imported tin, silver, and luxury goods arrived from Phoenician and Etruscan networks. Northward expansion into the Black Sea region extended Greek influence into Thrace, modern-day Bulgaria, and the Crimean Peninsula. Colonies such as Miletus, Odessos, Varna, and Chersonesus established ports that linked mainland Greece to grain-producing hinterlands. The region's river systems facilitated transport of cereals, timber, and fish, while Greek merchants introduced coinage, standardized weights, and pottery styles. Archaeologists have recovered amphorae marked with civic symbols, suggesting both trade regulation and civic branding. The spread of the Greek language through these colonies enabled communication, legal contracts, and the preservation of oral and written tradition, reinforcing a shared Hellenic identity across distance. The economic dimension of expansion was closely tied to cultural transmission. Colonies acted as nodes of exchange, facilitating the circulation of goods, technologies, and ideas. Greek artisans exported ceramic techniques, metalworking methods, and architectural forms. Simultaneously, they absorbed local innovations, adapting them to Hellenic tastes. The Orientalizing influence persisted in these contexts, as motifs from the Near East appeared in pottery, sculpture, and jewelry, especially along Phoenician trading routes. Coinage, first issued in the late 7th century BCE in Lydia and quickly adopted in Greek cities, became a critical instrument for standardizing commercial interaction and reinforcing civic authority abroad. Socially, colonization reshaped the Greek world. Migrant communities maintained ties with their metropolis, dedicating temples, sending religious envoys, and observing festivals that linked them culturally and ritually. Simultaneously, colonies often developed distinctive institutions suited to local conditions. For example, Syracuse evolved a complex oligarchic structure balancing merchant and landowning elites, while Massalia, modern Marseille, adopted a council-based system reflecting both Greek models and local Celtic interaction. This combination of continuity and adaptation demonstrates the flexibility of the polis model, allowing it to operate successfully across diverse geographies. From an analytical perspective, Greek expansion illustrates how demographic, economic, and cultural pressures interact to produce outward colonization. Limited arable land at home drove migration. Trade ambitions incentivized the creation of ports and shared cultural frameworks. Language, religion, ritual facilitated cohesion in distant territories. Expansion was thus not merely a consequence of population pressure but a systemic process integrating settlement, commerce, and identity. Colonies stabilized political and economic networks, while fostering a common sense of Greek belonging across disparate regions. By the end of the Archaic Age, the Greek world had been transformed. Greek language, artistic styles, religious practice, and political institutions were no longer confined to the Aegean. They extended from the Black Sea in the north to Sicily and southern Italy in the west. Trade networks connected Greek settlements to the Near East, Etruria, and North Africa, creating a dense web of interaction. These networks allowed ideas, technologies, and cultural norms to circulate with unprecedented efficiency, reinforcing the cohesion of Hellenic civilization despite political fragmentation. Colonization also prepared Greece for external challenges. The expansion of Greek settlements brought the polis into closer contact with powerful neighbors, particularly Persia, which controlled much of Anatolia and posed a growing strategic threat. The experience of overseas settlement, maritime coordination, and shared ritual observance would later facilitate collective action in the face of foreign invasion. In this way, the Archaic expansion set the stage for both the cultural flourishing and military mobilization that defined the classical period. By 500 BCE, the Greek world stretched across seas and met an empire far greater, Persia. It began on the shores of Asia Minor, a revolt that drew the wrath of kings. The Persian Wars were preceded by nearly a decade of unrest in Asia Minor, known as the Ionian Revolt, 499 to 494 BCE. Ionia, a region of Greek settlements along the western coast of Anatolia, had been under the dominion of the Achaemenid Empire since the reign of Cyrus the Great, c. 550 BCE. Persian governance imposed satrapal oversight and tribute obligations, which, while tolerated initially, increasingly frustrated the Ionian polis, particularly when local tyrants, often installed or sanctioned by the Persians, abused power. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Miletus, Ephesus, and Smyrna demonstrates material prosperity alongside defensive fortifications, suggesting a tension between economic growth and political subjugation. The revolt was catalyzed by a combination of economic strain, political ambition, and cultural identity. Herodotus emphasizes the role of tyrannical rulers in inciting rebellion, notably Histiaeus of Miletus and Aristagoras, whose efforts to maintain personal power coincided with broader civic discontent. Greek polis, facing enforced tribute and interference in local governance, saw an opportunity to assert autonomy. Archaeological surveys confirm evidence of destruction layers in Ionian cities around 499 BCE, consistent with brief episodes of urban conflict and Persian reprisal. Support from mainland Greece played a symbolic rather than decisive role. Athens and Eretria sent ships to aid the Ionians, demonstrating the growing sense of pan-Hellenic solidarity that had emerged in the Archaic period. According to Herodotus, around 20 ships were dispatched to assist Miletus, a gesture that linked Aegean Greeks to their Anatolian kin. Though numerically modest, this intervention represented a strategic and ideological challenge to Persian authority, signaling that rebellion in Ionia was not purely local, but had implications for the wider Greek world. The revolt, however, was ultimately suppressed by Darius I, who sought to reassert imperial authority and deter future uprisings. Persian forces systematically reconquered the Ionian cities, burning Miletus and executing leaders to set an example. Excavations of Miletus revealed destruction consistent with large-scale sacking in 494 BCE, corroborating literary accounts of punitive measures. Darius's response extended beyond military retaliation. He reorganized the satrapy, increased garrison presence, and required tribute payments that reinforced Persian control. The suppression of the Ionian revolt demonstrates both the logistical reach of the Achaemenid administration and its capacity to integrate punitive measures with regional governance. Herodotus's narrative emphasizes drama, individual ambition, and moral causation, but modern scholarship compares these accounts with archaeological and epigraphic evidence to distinguish fact from literary embellishment. While his chronology is generally reliable, some details, such as exact troop numbers or the personal involvement of certain Greek cities, are debated. In particular, the extent of Spartan and Corinthian involvement appears exaggerated. Physical evidence suggests primarily Athenian and Eretrian support. Nevertheless, Herodotus captures the broader dynamics: the collision between local autonomy, Persian imperial interest, and emerging Greek solidarity. Strategically, the Ionian revolt exposed the vulnerability of the Persian Empire along its western frontier. The rebellion revealed both the limits of satrapal authority and the potential of Greek city-states to coordinate resistance. This insight likely influenced Persian planning in subsequent campaigns, particularly under Darius, who sought to expand punitive expeditions into the Aegean and, ultimately, mainland Greece. The revolt also provided invaluable military experience for the Greeks, exposing them to Persian tactics, fortifications, and logistical organization. Economically and culturally, the Ionian revolt had lasting implications. Cities like Miletus, despite devastation, retained their commercial networks and intellectual vitality. The experience reinforced civic identity among the Ionian Greeks and strengthened ties with the mainland. Moreover, the revolt underscored the role of maritime mobility in Greek warfare. Control of ships and access to ports became critical in resisting larger powers. Archaeological finds, including weapon caches and destroyed harbor installations, suggest that naval capacity was central to both the uprising and its suppression. Analytically, The Ionian Revolt illustrates the interplay of imperial reach and local autonomy. Persia's administrative sophistication allowed it to suppress dissent, yet Greek political structures, civic assemblies, local tyrants, and alliances provided mechanisms for organized resistance. The episode demonstrates how political, cultural, and geographic factors converge to shape early Greek-Persian interaction. It also foreshadows the broader conflicts of the Persian Wars, where the balance of local initiative and imperial ambition would determine the fate of the Greek world. By 494 BCE, the Ionian Revolt had been extinguished, but the precedent of Greek resistance endured. Persian wrath, initially directed toward rebellious cities, now extended westward toward the Aegean mainland. The Athenian and Eretrian intervention, though limited in scale, guaranteed that the conflict would not remain confined to Anatolia. Darius's ambition to punish these cities set the stage for the first major clash on Greek soil, the Battle of Marathon, signaling the beginning of a continental confrontation that would define the course of Hellenic history. That wrath crossed the Aegean and met its match at Marathon. At Marathon, a small democracy stood against the might of empire. In 490 BCE, the first Persian invasion of mainland Greece brought the Achaemenid army under Darius I to the plain of Marathon, approximately 40 miles northeast of Athens. The campaign was a direct response to the Ionian Revolt and the participation of Athens and Eretria in supporting the rebels. Persian forces, estimated by Herodotus at roughly 25,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, aimed to punish the Athenians and secure the Aegean coast. Archaeological surveys of Marathon, including the identification of burial mounds and scattered weaponry, confirm the site's strategic significance and suggest a major engagement occurred there. The Athenians, supported nominally by a small contingent from Plataea, faced a numerically superior opponent, yet they relied on cohesion, terrain, and innovative tactics. The Athenian hoplite phalanx, arranged across the narrow coastal plain, exploited the flat battlefield to maximize the effectiveness of their heavy infantry. Herodotus describes a deliberate strengthening of the flanks relative to the center, enabling the Athenians to envelop the Persian wings. This tactical adjustment, corroborated by modern military analysis, reflects both strategic acumen and adaptive leadership. Leadership at Marathon was exercised collectively by the 10 Athenian generals or strategoi, with Miltiades playing a prominent operational role. According to sources, Miltiades persuaded the assembly to adopt an aggressive approach despite initial caution, recognizing that delaying engagement would favor the Persians' cavalry and archers. Archaeological evidence, including the burial mound Soros, dedicated to the fallen, supports the high proportion of casualties on the Greek side's flanks, consistent with an enveloping maneuver. The mound remains a tangible reminder of both sacrifice and triumph. The battle itself, though brief in duration, had significant tactical and symbolic consequences. The Athenians reportedly advanced at a run, minimizing exposure to Persian missile fire and engaging in close combat where the hoplite phalanx was most effective. Persian infantry, lightly armored compared to Greek hoplites, suffered heavy losses during frontal engagement and in the enveloping attacks. The victory at Marathon, while modest in absolute numbers, represented a decisive defense of autonomy, demonstrating that disciplined citizen soldiers could resist imperial forces. Marathon also had profound implications for Athenian morale and political identity. The successful defense reinforced confidence in citizen governance and military organization. Contemporary inscriptions and later commemorations emphasized the integration of civic and military achievement. Victory was framed as a collective accomplishment of the polis, rather than the triumph of individual heroes. The establishment of the Marathon burial mound and subsequent annual commemorations, such as the Panathenaic celebrations, institutionalized this memory, linking military success to civic virtue. Economically and strategically, the victory disrupted Persian plans for regional domination. While Darius retained control over Asia Minor, the failure to secure a foothold on the Attic Plain delayed Persian expansion for a decade. Athens' victory safeguarded its immediate hinterland, preserved access to maritime trade routes, and enhanced the city's prestige among other Greek polis. The demonstration that a relatively small but organized force could defeat Persia inspired wider Hellenic confidence and laid the groundwork for future cooperative resistance. From an analytical perspective, Marathon illustrates the interaction of terrain, military innovation, and civic cohesion. The battle demonstrates that institutionalized citizen-soldier armies could counter numerically superior forces, a principle that would recur in subsequent conflicts. It also highlights the role of strategic foresight and leadership consensus, as the Greek assembly's deliberation underlines the interplay between democratic governance and wartime decision-making. Archaeological evidence of weapon fragments, burial mounds, and contemporary dedications confirms these historical accounts, linking literary and material records. Symbolically, Marathon became an enduring touchstone for the notion of Greek unity in the face of external threats. While the battle involved only Athens and Plataea, its memory resonated across the Greek world, representing the possibility that collective action and civic resolve could withstand imperial aggression. This perception contributed to a developing pan-Hellenic consciousness that complemented existing cultural and religious networks, connecting political independence with shared identity. By 490 BCE, the Persian attempt to subjugate mainland Greece had been thwarted, yet the conflict was not concluded. The Athenian victory at Marathon demonstrated the effectiveness of citizen soldiers and the resilience of democratic institutions, but it also alerted Persia to the strategic challenge posed by the Greek polis. The empire's response would be measured and far-reaching. 10 years later, a renewed Persian expedition would return, this time larger, more disciplined, and determined to exact conquest across the Hellenic world. A decade later, Persia returned stronger, larger, and determined. Fire consumed Athens, but the sea turned the tide. In 480 BCE, Xerxes I launched a massive expedition to subjugate the Greek city-states, assembling forces that classical sources claim numbered in the hundreds of thousands, though modern estimates suggest a smaller yet still formidable army and fleet. The campaign, meticulously organized and logistically ambitious, followed Darius' earlier attempt to punish Athens and Eretria. Persian forces advanced through northern Greece, forcing a series of strategic decisions that would define the defense of the Hellenic world. The narrow pass of Thermopylae became the focal point of resistance. Here, a coalition of Greek city-states, led by King Leonidas I of Sparta, sought to block the Persian advance. Herodotus records that the force numbered approximately 7,000, including 300 Spartans, Thespians, and other allies. Archaeological surveys of the pass and surrounding terrain confirmed the suitability of Thermopylae as a defensive choke point. The narrow corridor limited the effectiveness of the Persian numerical advantage and constrained cavalry and archers. The battle exemplified the integration of terrain and tactical discipline in Greek warfare. The stand at Thermopylae, though ultimately resulting in the Persian breakthrough due to betrayal by Ephialtes, served a strategic and symbolic purpose. It delayed the Persian advance, allowing for the evacuation of Athens and the preparation of naval forces. The sacrifice of Leonidas and his contingent became central to Greek self-perception, a model of courage, duty, and disciplined resistance. In material terms, the Leonidas monument at Thermopylae and later commemorations illustrate the early Greek practice of linking battlefield heroism to civic memory. Simultaneously, the Greek navy concentrated in the Straits of Salamis, anticipating the Persian fleet's approach. Athenian leadership, particularly Themistocles, advocated for engagement in narrow waters where Persian numerical superiority would be negated. Herodotus details the coordination of roughly 370 Greek triremes, exploiting maneuverability and collective command to outmatch a larger Persian force. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence, including shipwreck sites and harbor remains, corroborates the presence of extensive Athenian maritime preparation and fortification. The Battle of Salamis, 480 BCE, decisively shifted the campaign's momentum. Greek triremes, operating in disciplined lines, executed ramming tactics and employed local knowledge of currents and shoals to confound the Persian fleet. The narrow straits prevented the Persians from exploiting their larger numbers and cavalry-based support. Persian losses were substantial, forcing Xerxes to retreat with a portion of his army and fleet. Salamis demonstrated the strategic value of naval coordination the adaptability of Greek forces, and the efficacy of citizen soldier fleets under centralized command, principles that would dominate later Greek warfare. Following Salamis, Persian forces regrouped but faced increasing logistical strain. The following year, 479 BCE, a unified Greek army under Pausanias of Sparta confronted the remaining Persian land forces at Plataea. Here, combined hoplite contingents from multiple poleis utilized phalanx formations, coordinated maneuvers, and superior discipline to defeat Persian infantry and cavalry. Archaeological investigations at Plataea, including mass graves and battlefield debris, support accounts of heavy Persian casualties and highlight the scale of Greek cooperation. The victory at Plataea effectively ended the Persian threat in mainland Greece, ensuring the continued autonomy of the Hellenic states. The Persian Wars illustrate several systemic features of Greek military and political organization. First, the combination of citizen-soldier armies, cohesive civic institutions, and maritime capacity allowed small polities to resist a numerically superior empire. Second, the coordination of independent poleis under temporary alliances exemplified the practical integration of local autonomy with collective strategy, a hallmark of archaic and early classical diplomacy. Third, the Greek emphasis on terrain and tactical adaptation, as seen at Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea, underscores the interaction of geography, military technology, and strategic innovation in determining outcomes. Culturally, the wars reinforced both pan-Hellenic identity and local pride. Shared sacrifice and victory at Salamis and Plataea fostered a common narrative that transcended poleis, solidifying the sense of Hellenes as a distinct cultural and military community. Monuments, inscribed dedications, and commemorative festivals, such as those held at Delphi and Olympia, celebrated both collective achievement and individual heroism. This dual emphasis strengthened the cohesion necessary for subsequent political and military cooperation in the classical period. Economically, the war's impact was uneven. Coastal cities like Athens suffered temporary destruction and displacement, while the disruption of Persian maritime activity opened trade routes in the Aegean. The experience highlighted the strategic importance of controlling sea lanes and reinforced Athens' subsequent investment in naval capacity, exemplified by the construction of a permanent fleet, a policy that would have profound consequences during the Delian League and later imperial expansion. Analytically, the Persian Wars exemplify the interplay of imperial ambition and local initiative. Persia's logistical and administrative sophistication enabled large-scale campaigns, but the resilience, cohesion, and adaptability of Greek city-states ultimately determined outcomes. The war also illustrates the influence of alliances, shared religious and cultural frameworks, and tactical innovation in enabling decentralized polities to resist external domination. These lessons would resonate throughout subsequent Greek military and political thought. By 479 BCE, with the victories at Salamis and Plataea, the Persian threat was neutralized, and Greece emerged not merely victorious but transformed. The conflicts had demonstrated the capacity of citizen armies to repel empire, highlighted the strategic significance of naval power, and reinforced the cultural bonds that underpinned pan-Hellenic identity. Victory against Persia transformed Greece, from defense to dominance. Victory brought unity, and unity brought empire. In the aftermath of the Persian Wars, the Greek world faced both opportunity and instability. The liberation of the Aegean poleis from Persian control created a security vacuum and the necessity of continued defense against potential resurgence. In 478 BCE, Athens spearheaded the formation of the Delian League, a maritime alliance initially conceived as a mutual defense organization. Members contributed ships or tribute to a common treasury, originally located on the island of Delos, to fund the fleet and maintain naval dominance against any lingering Persian threat. The League's early inscriptions and tribute lists attest to participation by over 150 city-states, demonstrating the wide geographic reach and cooperative framework of this alliance. Athens rapidly assumed leadership within the League, leveraging its substantial naval resources. Unlike Sparta, which remained land-focused, Athens invested in shipbuilding, logistics, and maritime infrastructure. Archaeological excavations of the Athenian navy yards at Piraeus reveal extensive slipways, docks, and storage facilities, indicating large-scale, state-sponsored production and maintenance of triremes. The city's dominance of the League fleet allowed Athens to control strategic sea lanes, enforce contributions from member states, and protect trade routes across the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean. Under Cimon and later Pericles, Athens transformed the League from a defensive coalition into an instrument of imperial authority. Tribute payments, once voluntarily provided for collective defense, increasingly funded Athenian civic projects, including fortifications, temples, and public works. The movement of the treasury from Delos to Athens in 454 BCE symbolized this shift, cementing the city's centrality and control. Records from the period, including stone inscriptions and epigraphic tribute lists, confirm both the fiscal scale of the League and the systematic administration required to manage distant member contributions. The consolidation of Athenian power was complemented by political reforms under Pericles, c. 495 to 429 BCE, which strengthened democratic institutions while facilitating imperial administration. Through expanded participation in the ecclesia and payment for public office and jury service, Athens ensured that governance reflected a broad citizen base even as the state exercised authority over external allies. The combination of domestic democracy and imperial oversight created a paradoxical system. Citizens enjoyed self-governance at home while exerting hegemony abroad. This structure allowed Athens to mobilize human and material resources efficiently, sustaining both defensive and expansionary initiatives. Economically, control of the League facilitated wealth accumulation and urban development. Tribute revenues funded monumental architecture, such as the Parthenon and the Propylaea, along with the patronage of artists, sculptors, and playwrights. Archaeological evidence of imported luxury goods, imported stone, and decorative artifacts underscores the connection between League wealth and cultural production. Athens' dominance of trade routes allowed for sustained economic integration, linking the city's prosperity to its maritime empire and enabling it to exert influence across the Aegean, Ionia, and beyond. Culturally and ideologically, the Delian League also served to legitimize Athenian authority. Religious ceremonies, festivals, and the sponsorship of pan-Hellenic events projected an image of leadership and guardianship. Inscriptions and dedications reveal a deliberate alignment of military, civic, and religious narratives to reinforce Athens' role as both protector and center of Hellenic identity. Athens positioned itself as the defender of freedom against Persia, while simultaneously exercising political and financial control over other Greek polis, creating tensions that would later provoke resentment and resistance. The League's structure illustrates key systemic dynamics of classical imperial formation. Athens combined military supremacy, fiscal control, and ideological legitimacy to transform a voluntary alliance into a quasi-imperial framework. The reliance on tribute rather than conquest maintained formal independence for member states, yet practical autonomy was constrained by Athens' ability to enforce compliance through naval power. Inscriptions detailing tributes and records of military interventions highlight the administrative sophistication required to manage a dispersed and semi-autonomous network of states. By the mid-5th century BCE, Athens had become both the cultural and military hegemon of the Aegean. Its empire, while rooted in collective defense, had evolved into a centralized system where economic, political, and military authority converged in the city. The Delian League exemplifies how post-war coalitions can transition into long-term structures of dominance, balancing ideological legitimacy with coercive power. Empire, however, brought rivalry and soon civil war. Never before had citizens so directly shaped a state, or so deeply reflected on it in art. By the mid-5th century BCE, Athens had achieved a level of civic sophistication unprecedented in the Greek world. The reforms of Cleisthenes, consolidated under Pericles, had established a democracy in which male citizens participated directly in legislation, judicial processes, and military organization. The ecclesia, or citizen assembly, met regularly on the Nix Hill to debate policy, while the Boule, a council of 500, coordinated daily administration and supervised fiscal and military matters. Epigraphic evidence. including stone inscriptions recording decrees and voting outcomes, provides clear documentation of this participatory framework. Citizen involvement extended beyond governance into civic self-conception. Democracy encouraged active engagement in public life, fostering a culture in which political discourse, debate, and responsibility were central to identity. The payment for public office and jury service ensured that participation was not limited to the wealthy, embedding practical mechanisms of inclusion. This system reinforced both civic cohesion and accountability, while also creating tensions among polis less accustomed to democratic structures, contributing to interpolis rivalries. The period's political confidence found expression in monumental architecture, most famously on the Acropolis of Athens. Pericles' building program, c. 447 to 432 BCE, included the Parthenon, a Doric temple dedicated to Athena Parthenos, and the Propylaea, the ceremonial gateway to the Acropolis. Archaeological analysis reveals advanced engineering techniques, including refined column entasis, precise proportionality, and sculptural programs integrating mythological narratives. The Parthenon's friezes and metopes depicted both religious devotion and civic ideology, celebrating the triumph of order and unity over chaos and barbarism. These structures not only served ritual functions but also symbolized the city's wealth, artistic sophistication, and democratic ideals. Simultaneously, Athens cultivated a rich literary and dramatic culture. Tragedy emerged as a medium for civic reflection, exploring themes of justice, morality, and the consequences of human action. Aeschylus introduced formal structure and expanded the role of the chorus, often dramatizing conflicts between divine law and human agency. His Persian trilogy, performed in the aftermath of the Persian Wars, reinforced both historical memory and civic identity. Sophocles' advanced character development and complex moral dilemmas, exemplified in works like Oedipus Rex, which interrogated fate, leadership, and civic responsibility. Euripides slightly later incorporated social critique, challenging assumptions about war, gender, and authority. Surviving manuscripts, fragments, and performance records indicate that these plays were staged during religious festivals, particularly the Dionysia, linking artistic innovation to communal ritual and reinforcing the integration of civic, religious, and cultural life. The interplay between democracy and drama highlights the reflective quality of Athenian society. Citizens engaged not only in governance but also in critical observation of their own institutions. Tragedy, by dramatizing ethical and political dilemmas, provided a mechanism for public deliberation outside the assembly. The stage functioned as a forum of civic education, fostering collective contemplation of justice, duty, and the limits of power. Artistic production, therefore, was not merely decorative but constitutive of the democratic ethos, reinforcing values that informed both policy and personal conduct. Athens' artistic achievements extended to other media as well. Sculpture, vase painting, and architecture followed evolving aesthetic conventions that emphasized proportion, realism, and narrative coherence. Archaeological finds, including painted amphorae, statuary, and reliefs, demonstrate the circulation of visual culture across the Mediterranean, linking Athens to its colonies and trading partners. Coinage, also featuring civic symbols such as Athena and the owl, reinforced the city's identity and facilitated economic integration. Together, these cultural products reflect a synergistic relationship between civic participation, artistic innovation, and material expression. Education and intellectual inquiry further reinforced this civic culture. Schools, philosophical gatherings, and informal instruction disseminated literacy, rhetorical skill, and historical knowledge. The codification of laws, the recording of decrees, and the production of historical narratives by authors such as Herodotus provided citizens with frameworks for understanding political and military events. The convergence of literacy, civic engagement, and artistic reflection underpinned a culture in which participation and comprehension were mutually reinforcing, creating a sophisticated, self-aware society capable of both critical thought and practical governance. Yet, This period of intellectual and artistic flourishing coexisted with increasing political tension. The expansion of Athenian influence through the Delian League, combined with domestic wealth and cultural confidence, heightened rivalry with other polis, particularly Sparta. Internal political divisions, the pressures of imperial administration, and debates over civic priorities contributed to fractures that would later erupt in open conflict. The democratic processes that enabled cultural innovation also amplified dissent and created avenues for competing ambitions, revealing both the strengths and vulnerabilities of Athens' system. By 431 BCE, Athens had established itself as the cultural, political, and intellectual leader of the Greek world. Its democracy engaged citizens in decision-making. Its architecture embodied civic pride and religious devotion. Its drama and literature reflected on ethical and political dimensions of communal life. Together, these developments defined the Golden Century, a period in which art, thought, and governance were mutually constitutive and set enduring precedents for the classical era. Yet amid creativity, political tension deepened. In Athens, thought itself became a new frontier. During the 5th century BCE, Athens became the intellectual heart of the Greek world. The city's democratic institutions, cultural prosperity, and extensive networks of trade and communication created an environment conducive to systematic inquiry. Citizens not only participated in governance and public debate, but also engaged in critical examination of ethics, politics, and natural phenomena. Philosophy emerged as a formalized discipline, seeking rational explanations for human behavior, social organization, and the cosmos. The Sophists were among the first to professionalize teaching in rhetoric, ethics, and civic responsibility. Figures such as Protagoras and Gorgias traveled widely, instructing citizens in persuasive speech and critical reasoning. Their approach emphasized relative knowledge, debate, and the practical application of argumentation in civic life. In doing so, the Sophists challenged traditional authority, including religious orthodoxy and inherited norms, encouraging Athenians to evaluate claims based on evidence, logic, and rhetorical skill. Contemporary inscriptions and fragments of their writings confirm both the pedagogical methods employed and their influence on legal and political practice. Socrates, 469 to 399 BCE, exemplified a parallel but distinct trajectory in Athenian thought. Rejecting the Sophists' emphasis on relativity, Socrates pursued an ethical and rational inquiry aimed at uncovering universal principles underlying human conduct. The Socratic method, based on questioning and dialectical reasoning, probed assumptions and encouraged self-reflection. While Socrates left no writings, accounts from Plato and Xenophon provide detailed insight into his techniques and philosophical priorities. His approach integrated civic engagement with moral investigation, illustrating the interdependence of political life and philosophical reflection in Athens. Historical inquiry also flourished in this period, with a focus on systematic observation, evidence, and causality. Herodotus, c. 484 to 425 BCE, often called the father of history, compiled narratives of the Persian Wars, combining ethnography, political analysis, and military reporting. While he included anecdotal material and oral tradition, Herodotus emphasized causation, geography, and the interactions between human agency and environmental factors. Archaeological evidence and epigraphic findings, when cross-referenced with his accounts, demonstrate a high degree of factual accuracy in key military and civic details, confirming the practical value of his historiography. Following Herodotus, Thucydides, c. 460 to 400 BCE, advanced historical methodology through rigorous empirical standards. His history of the Peloponnesian War emphasizes eyewitness testimony, critical evaluation of sources, and analysis of political and military causation. Thucydides rejected divine explanation in favor of rational, human-centered accounts. His work demonstrates an early recognition of systemic forces, economic pressure, strategic imperatives, and civic psychology, shaping historical outcomes. Material evidence, including fortifications, inscriptions, and contemporary accounts, aligns with his narrative, validating both methodology and insight. The intellectual milieu of Athens integrated philosophy, rhetoric, and history into a cohesive civic framework. Citizens engaged with abstract reasoning, strategic thinking, and ethical reflection, informed by direct participation in political and military life. Schools, symposiums, and public lectures facilitated the dissemination of ideas, ensuring that philosophical and historical inquiry contributed to both private deliberation and collective decision-making. Literacy, inscriptional culture, and the circulation of texts enhanced the permanence and reach of these intellectual innovations. Analytically, the emergence of rational inquiry reflects the interaction of institutional, cultural, and practical factors. Democracy required informed deliberation, cultural prosperity supported artistic and literary experimentation, and ongoing military and political challenges demanded critical problem-solving. Philosophy and history were not isolated disciplines but integral to civic life, shaping citizens' understanding of law, governance, strategy, and morality. Athens' intellectual achievements were therefore inseparable from its political and social structures. This period of philosophical and historical innovation laid enduring foundations. The methods developed by Socrates, the Sophists, Herodotus, and Thucydides influenced not only subsequent Greek thinkers but also the intellectual trajectory of Western civilization. Emphasis on evidence, argument, and critical reasoning established standards for inquiry that transcended immediate political exigencies, contributing to the broader humanistic tradition. By the early 430s BCE, Athens had established itself as the preeminent center of both civic and intellectual life. Its citizens wielded unprecedented political influence, reflected on their institutions through art, literature, and philosophy, and recorded their experiences with analytical rigor. These achievements, however, coincided with intensifying rivalry with Sparta, setting the stage for the catastrophic conflicts of the Peloponnesian War. That frontier would soon be tested by war. Greece turned upon itself, democracy versus discipline. The Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, arose from a complex interplay of political, economic, and strategic factors that had been developing throughout the 5th century BCE. Athens, empowered by its leadership of the Delian League, had transformed from a cooperative maritime alliance into an empire asserting dominance across the Aegean. Tribute payments, enforcement of naval power, and intervention in allied polis internal affairs generated widespread resentment. In Sparta and its Peloponnesian allies, known collectively as the Peloponnesian League, this expansion was perceived as a direct threat to their hegemony and traditional land-based security. The immediate causes of conflict crystallized in the late 430s BCE. Disputes over Corcyra, modern Corfu, and Potidaea highlighted Athens' willingness to exert military influence and defend its interests aggressively. Sparta, bound by obligations to allies and committed to maintaining the balance of power, interpreted these actions as provocations demanding a response. Thucydides emphasizes that the deeper structural cause lay in Athenian growth and Spartan fear, reflecting the systemic tension between rising naval imperial power and conservative land-based oligarchies. These dynamics illustrate how expansionist ambition and security concerns can generate interstate conflict, even in culturally cohesive regions. The Archidamian War, 431 to 421 BCE, named for the Spartan king Archidamus II, constituted the first phase of the Peloponnesian conflict. Sparta adopted a strategy of annual invasions of Attica, seeking to disrupt agricultural production and compel Athens to engage on land. Athens, by contrast, relied on naval mobility, fortifications, and the logistical advantage of its walls and ports. The strategy included Pericles' defensive policy, whereby citizens withdrew behind the long walls connecting Athens to Piraeus, preserving naval supply lines while avoiding direct confrontation on open ground. Archaeological surveys of the long walls and contemporaneous fortifications support Thucydides' account, confirming the physical and strategic measures Athens employed to sustain prolonged defense. Military operations in the early years demonstrated both strengths and limitations of the respective systems. Spartan invasions imposed localized devastation on Attica, damaging crops and settlements, but Athens' naval raids and control of maritime routes mitigated the strategic effect. The plague of 430 to 429 BCE, which struck densely populated Athens, introduced a catastrophic variable. Contemporary sources, including Thucydides' eyewitness account, describe mortality rates of roughly a third of the population, including Pericles himself. Archaeological and osteological evidence from mass burials in Athens corroborates the severity of the epidemic. The plague not only reduced manpower but also eroded morale and destabilized civic administration, illustrating how disease can act as a systemic factor in protracted warfare. Economically, the war imposed a dual burden. Athens relied on tribute from the Delian League and maritime commerce, which sustained its fleet and urban population. Blockades, raids, and the disruption of allied contributions stressed fiscal capacity, requiring careful allocation of resources. Sparta, with a less monetized economy, mobilized manpower and local agricultural production but lacked the naval infrastructure to threaten Athens' supply lines effectively. This divergence underscores the interaction of economic structure, military capability, and strategic doctrine in shaping wartime outcomes. The early phase of the war also reveals the interplay of political ideology and military strategy. Athens' democratic system allowed for debate over strategy, resource allocation, and policy, facilitating flexibility but also generating internal dissent. Sparta's oligarchic structure provided centralized command and continuity of decision-making but was less adaptable to novel challenges, particularly maritime operations. These contrasts shaped not only immediate tactical outcomes but also the trajectory of the conflict, reinforcing systemic advantages and vulnerabilities inherent in each polity. Analytically, the Archidamian War illustrates the interaction of imperial ambition, security imperatives, and structural asymmetry. Athens' growth created both opportunity and friction, while Sparta's defensive posture relied on traditional military strengths and collective alliance obligations. The early engagements set patterns of attrition, strategic adaptation, and resource competition that would persist across the protracted conflict. Thucydides' careful documentation emphasizes the long-term systemic consequences of these initial conditions, linking decisions made in the early 430s BCE to strategic, political, and demographic outcomes decades later. By 421 BCE, the Peace of Nicias temporarily paused hostilities, but neither side had resolved underlying tensions. The structural causes, Athenian imperialism, Spartan insecurity, and competing economic and military systems, remained unaddressed. As a result, war was only suspended, not concluded. The early conflict demonstrated that Greek warfare had evolved into a complex interplay of strategy, logistics, and civic resilience, with consequences extending far beyond individual battles. War would soon spread across generations. Within the city that defied Persia, unseen enemies struck harder. In the second year of the Peloponnesian War, Athens faced a crisis that was neither foreign nor conventional, a devastating plague that swept through the city in 430 BCE. Contemporary accounts, particularly Thucydides' detailed eyewitness narrative, describe a disease of high contagion and mortality, killing an estimated one-third of the population, including soldiers, sailors, and civilians. Archaeological and osteological studies of mass burials in and around Athens provide evidence consistent with the scale of mortality described, confirming the plague's catastrophic demographic impact. The immediate effects were profound. The densely populated city, confined behind the long walls, faced overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and rapid transmission. The plague disrupted military operations, as manpower shortages limited the deployment of hoplite forces and weakened Athens' naval capabilities. Social norms frayed under the strain of widespread death. Thucydides notes the collapse of traditional civic and religious practices, breakdowns in law enforcement, and a decline in moral restraint. Citizens faced an unprecedented test of resilience, revealing the vulnerabilities inherent in highly concentrated urban centers during prolonged conflict. Pericles, the dominant Athenian statesman and strategic leader, initially attempted to maintain political and military cohesion. His Periclean strategy emphasized defensive containment, reliance on naval supremacy, and the avoidance of direct engagement with the Spartan army in open battle. These policies had previously preserved Athenian security and enabled the city to project power across the Aegean. However, the plague undermined both the logistical and psychological foundations of this strategy. Loss of life diminished civic participation, weakened the ecclesia and boule, and strained administrative functions, highlighting the interdependence of human resources, governance, and military effectiveness. Pericles himself succumbed to the plague in 429 BCE, removing a central figure whose authority had balanced competing political factions and maintained strategic coherence. His death created a power vacuum, exacerbating existing divisions within the democratic assembly. Factionalism between more radical and conservative elements intensified, as citizens debated the continuation of imperial policy, the conduct of the war, and the distribution of resources. The absence of Pericles' steady leadership exposed the limitations of Athenian democracy under extreme stress, demonstrating how institutional resilience depends on both procedural mechanisms and capable statesmanship. The plague and political instability also contributed to shifts in moral and civic behavior. Thucydides records instances of lawlessness, erosion of traditional obligations, and increasing social tension. Religious rituals, previously central to communal cohesion, were neglected or performed inconsistently, reflecting both fear of contagion and a sense of civic disorientation. Economically, labor shortages disrupted agriculture and urban production, while trade routes were increasingly threatened by Spartan naval raids and the opportunistic activities of allies and subject polis. The combination of demographic loss, political fragmentation, and economic strain eroded the cohesion that had previously underpinned Athenian imperial success. Analytically, the events of 430 to 429 BCE illustrate the interplay between biological, political, and strategic systems. Athenian democracy, while robust under normal conditions, proved vulnerable to sudden demographic collapse and concentrated urban stress. Leadership, exemplified by Pericles, functioned as a stabilizing mechanism. Its absence magnified institutional fragility. The plague demonstrates how non-military threats can produce systemic consequences, influencing strategy, morale, and governance with effects as significant as those of enemy action. Despite the immediate crisis, Athens maintained operational continuity to some extent, relying on the long walls, its remaining fleet, and allied support. Yet the cumulative effects of the plague, combined with Pericles' death, marked a turning point in the war. Strategic coherence weakened, internal disputes intensified, and Athens' capacity to enforce imperial authority declined. This period also set precedents for subsequent decision-making errors, as later leaders struggled to maintain unity, manage resources, and respond effectively to the combined pressures of external threat and internal instability. By the end of 429 BCE, Athens remained a potent power, but its institutional and human foundations had been fundamentally compromised. The city's capacity to sustain prolonged conflict was diminished, signaling that the combination of war, disease, and political instability could undermine even the most resilient polities. These developments foreshadowed the challenges Athens would face in subsequent phases of the Peloponnesian War, where strategic missteps and internal division would contribute to the gradual erosion of its empire. Athenian strategy faltered. Its empire began to crumble. From empire to ashes, Athens' defeat reshaped the Greek world. By 415 BCE, Athens, still reeling from plague, internal strife, and prolonged conflict with Sparta, embarked on the Sicilian expedition, aiming to expand influence and secure resources in the Western Mediterranean. The campaign, endorsed by the Democratic Assembly, targeted Syracuse, a wealthy and strategically located city-state allied with Sparta. Contemporary sources, including Thucydides and Diodorus Siculus, describe the expedition as ambitious yet politically contentious, with prominent generals such as Alcibiades advocating for bold action while others warned of logistical and strategic overreach. Archaeological surveys of Syracuse reveal extensive fortifications and evidence of siege works consistent with historical accounts, confirming the scale and intensity of the conflict. The initial phase saw Athens dispatch a fleet of roughly 134 triremes and 5,000 infantry, along with allied contingents. However, internal mismanagement, divided command, and the defection of Alcibiades to Sparta undermined operational cohesion. Syracuse, under the capable leadership of Hermocrates and supported by Spartan military advisors, implemented effective defensive strategies, including fortified walls, counterattacks, and naval maneuvers exploiting local geography. The Athenians faced difficulties in siege logistics, supply lines, and coordination, demonstrating the challenges of extended campaigns far from the Aegean base of operations. The campaign deteriorated further with the arrival of Spartan reinforcements under Gylippus, whose strategic interventions stabilized Syracuse and coordinated attacks on Athenian forces. Blockades, ambushes, and attritional tactics gradually eroded Athenian morale and combat effectiveness. Thucydides emphasizes that the Athenians, unaccustomed to protracted sieges in distant theaters, suffered severe casualties and loss of ships, which, combined with disease and desertion, transformed an ambitious expedition into a catastrophic failure. Archaeological remains, including mass graves and weapon deposits, corroborate the scale of loss and the decisive nature of the Syracusan defense. The failure in Sicily had cascading consequences. Athens lost nearly its entire fleet and thousands of soldiers, severely limiting its capacity for naval projection. Tribute payments from the Delian League faltered as subject states sensed weakness, and internal political divisions intensified as blame was cast upon leadership and democratic decision-making. The catastrophe exposed the vulnerability of Athens' imperial structure, highlighting the interdependence of maritime logistics, citizen-soldier manpower, and strategic prudence. In the following years, Sparta, under the command of Lysander, capitalized on Athens' weakened position. By 405 BCE, Lysander had assembled a superior fleet and coordinated with Persian resources to blockade Athens at Aegospotami, cutting off grain shipments and further strangling the city's economy. Archaeological evidence of naval facilities and battle debris along the Hellespont supports accounts of decisive engagement and Athenian rout. The blockade prevented resupply and reinforcements, forcing Athens into a protracted siege with mounting civilian suffering and resource depletion. In 404 BCE, Athens surrendered unconditionally. Spartan forces dismantled its long walls, confiscated the fleet, and imposed oligarchic governance through the 30 tyrants, ending the Athenian Empire. Economic disruption, political repression, and social dislocation followed, leaving the city politically subordinate while Sparta temporarily assumed hegemony over mainland Greece. Contemporary accounts, reinforced by inscriptions and epigraphic decrees, attest to the imposition of Spartan authority and the subsequent reorganization of civic structures. Analytically, the Peloponnesian War and Athens' defeat demonstrate the systemic consequences of overextension, strategic miscalculation, and prolonged attrition. Athens' reliance on distant operations, coupled with internal factionalism and demographic losses, illustrates how external campaigns can amplify domestic vulnerabilities. The interplay of logistics, naval power, and alliance management proved decisive, highlighting the structural limitations of even the most sophisticated maritime empires. The war also reshaped the political and cultural landscape of Greece. Sparta's temporary dominance confirmed the efficacy of disciplined land-based military organization but lacked the administrative and cultural capacity for sustained imperial governance. Athens, though militarily defeated, retained its intellectual and artistic influence, setting the stage for recovery and later innovation in philosophy, drama, and civic life. The redistribution of power among polis destabilized the established balance, creating opportunities for emergent states and regional actors to assert influence. By 404 BCE, the Peloponnesian War had concluded with the collapse of Athenian imperial authority, demonstrating the fragility of even powerful city-states when subjected to sustained military, political, and economic pressures. The conflict's legacy extended beyond immediate territorial and political consequences, influencing subsequent Greek military doctrine, alliance formation, and strategic thinking for generations. In the ruins of war, New powers emerged, Macedonia among them. After Athens fell, Greece searched for leadership and found none. The conclusion of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BCE left Greece politically fragmented and militarily exhausted. Athens, though defeated, remained a cultural center, while Sparta assumed temporary hegemony, leveraging its land-based military dominance to assert control over the Peloponnesian League. However, Spartan authority was contested, and its rigid oligarchic governance struggled to maintain compliance among allies and subject states. The oligarchic imposition of the 30 tyrants in Athens had destabilized civic structures, and even after their overthrow, internal factionalism persisted. Sparta's brief ascendancy exposed structural vulnerabilities. Its focus on land power and conservative social hierarchy limited adaptability to naval and logistical challenges, creating opportunities for emergent powers. Spartan interference in central Greece, including conflicts with Corinth, Argos, and other city-states, fostered resentment and sporadic rebellion. The inability of a single city-state to secure lasting dominance gave rise to the Age of the Hegemonies, a period characterized by shifting alliances, local conflicts, and temporary coalitions rather than sustained empire. Thucydides' historiographical framework, along with epigraphic records of treaties and decrees, confirms the instability and multiplicity of competing powers during this era. Amid this turbulence, Thebes emerged as a formidable regional actor, particularly during the Corinthian War, 395 to 387 BCE, and the subsequent liberation of Boeotia. The Theban general Epaminondas innovated both tactics and political strategy, demonstrating the potential of disciplined, flexible armies to challenge traditional hegemonies. The decisive victory at Leuctra in 371 BCE over Sparta's elite hoplite forces exemplifies Theban innovation. The oblique phalanx concentrated strength against a specific sector of the Spartan line, exploiting numerical and tactical advantage. Archaeological evidence of battlefield topography and surviving fortifications corroborates Thucydides and Xenophon's accounts, confirming the scale and effectiveness of Theban military organization. Despite episodic success, Theban dominance was geographically limited and temporally brief. Persistent rivalries among the Peloponnesian League, Athens, and emerging powers prevented the consolidation of pan-Hellenic leadership. The systemic pattern of Greek politics, heavily reliant on city-state autonomy, fluctuating alliances, and the interplay of military and civic institutions, constrained any single power from establishing long-term hegemony. Each hegemon, whether Sparta or Thebes, faced internal and external limits that curtailed expansion beyond core territories. Economic and social factors further complicated post-war recovery. Population losses from the Peloponnesian War, coupled with disruption of trade networks, created fiscal and agricultural strain. Cities struggled to maintain citizen militias, naval fleets, and infrastructure. Evidence from coin hoards, harbor remains, and fortified settlements indicates uneven recovery and shifting patterns of economic influence. Local elites and mercenary forces played increasingly significant roles, reflecting both the militarization and professionalization of Greek warfare in the absence of stable centralized authority. The vacuum of pan-Hellenic leadership created both opportunity and vulnerability. External observers, particularly the northern kingdom of Macedon, monitored developments carefully. The fragmented Greek polis, though rich in military experience and cultural achievements, were unable to project sustained unity or defend against a coordinated external power. Macedon's rulers, beginning with Amyntas III and continuing under Philip II, capitalized on this disunity, studying Greek military tactics, diplomatic practices, and political structures while consolidating control over their own territory. Epigraphic records and archaeological surveys from Macedon demonstrate the systematic development of fortifications, cavalry, and administrative systems during this period, indicating a kingdom preparing for regional influence. Analytically, the Age of the Hegemonies illustrates the limitations of decentralized political systems in sustaining long-term strategic dominance. Sparta's land-based authority, Thebes' tactical innovations, and Athens' cultural resilience all highlight strengths, yet none could overcome the systemic constraints of city-state fragmentation. These dynamics set the stage for an external power, unified and strategically oriented, to assert influence over the Greek world. The Northern Kingdom, leveraging observation, consolidation, and innovation, positioned itself to exploit the vulnerabilities inherent in a divided peninsula. By the mid-4th century BCE, Greece remained rich in military expertise, culture, and intellectual achievement, yet politically unstable. Hegemonies rose and fell, temporary coalitions dissolved, and interpolis warfare persisted. This prolonged instability created conditions under which Macedon could emerge as a decisive power, capable of unifying and dominating the fragmented Hellenic states. To the north, a kingdom watched and learned. One man forged what centuries of cities could not: unity. By the mid-4th century BCE, Macedon emerged as a rising power under Philip II, reigned 359 to 336 BCE, whose combination of military innovation, diplomatic acumen, and political strategy transformed a peripheral kingdom into the dominant force in Greece. Philip inherited a fragmented realm threatened by Illyrian raids, Thracian incursions, and internal dissent. Recognizing that survival required both consolidation and modernization, he undertook systematic military, administrative, and diplomatic reforms that would redefine Macedon's capacity for power projection. Central to Philip's strategy was the professionalization of the army. He reorganized the phalanx, equipping soldiers with the sarissa, a pike approximately 18 feet long, and introducing rigorous training and disciplined cohesion. Cavalry and light infantry were integrated into coordinated combined arms tactics, allowing flexibility, mobility, and decisive battlefield advantage. Archaeological evidence of weaponry, armor, and fortifications corroborates historical accounts, illustrating both technological innovation and logistical sophistication. These reforms enabled Macedon to overcome numerically superior enemies, demonstrating the systemic importance of military organization in state consolidation. Philip paired military strength with diplomacy and alliance building. He skillfully negotiated marriages, treaties, and political agreements, exploiting rivalries among southern Greek city-states. Athens, Thebes, and other polis were compelled to navigate Macedon's growing influence, often choosing accommodation over conflict. Philip's engagement with Greek politics was not merely opportunistic. He studied military tactics, governance structures, and cultural practices, effectively learning from the very system that had historically resisted northern unification. Inscriptions, treaties, and epigraphic decrees provide evidence of his formal diplomatic initiatives, reflecting both strategic foresight and administrative control. The culmination of Philip's efforts occurred in 338 BCE at the Battle of Kyrenia, where Macedonian forces decisively defeated the allied armies of Athens and Thebes. Philip's tactical mastery, the integration of phalanx, cavalry, and flanking maneuvers, shattered traditional Greek hoplite formations. Historical accounts by Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch, supported by topographical and archaeological analysis of the Boeotian battlefield, confirm the scale and coordination of Macedon's forces. The victory ended the era of independent hegemonies, imposing a practical unification of Greece under Macedonian hegemony while maintaining formal city-state autonomy. Philip's political settlement following Kyrenia established the League of Corinth, a federal structure designed to legitimize Macedonian leadership while preserving the outward forms of polis independence. Member states retained internal governance but recognized Philip as hegemon, with authority over foreign policy and military coordination. The League's creation demonstrates Philip's understanding of Greek political culture. He balanced coercion and legitimacy, central authority, and local autonomy. Inscriptions documenting the League's formation illustrate both formal agreements and Philip's strategic use of institutionalized governance to consolidate power. Economically and logistically, Philip also strengthened Macedon's infrastructure to support sustained influence. Roads, fortifications, and administrative centers facilitated troop movements, resource distribution, and communication across the kingdom and into southern Greece. Coinage reforms, standardization of weights and measures, and taxation systems enhanced fiscal stability, ensuring that military and diplomatic initiatives were underwritten by secure resources. These systemic measures illustrate the interdependence of administrative organization, economic capacity, and military projection in statecraft. Philip's unification of Greece achieved not only military dominance but also strategic continuity. The formerly fractious city-states, exhausted by decades of war and internal division, were incorporated into a broader system that enabled coordinated action against external threats. The Macedonian model demonstrated the effectiveness of centralized authority, professionalized military structures, and strategic diplomacy in overcoming the historical limitations of fragmented polis governance. Athens and Thebes retained civic traditions, but their capacity for independent action was constrained by the institutional framework imposed by Macedon. Analytically, Philip's accomplishments illustrate the interaction of leadership, military innovation, and institutional design in shaping historical outcomes. Unlike earlier hegemonies, which relied on temporary coalitions and personal prestige, Macedon combined enduring organizational reforms with flexible diplomacy. This systemic approach ensured both immediate battlefield success and long-term political stability, setting the stage for subsequent expansion under his son. By 336 BCE, Philip had unified Greece under Macedonian hegemony, positioning the kingdom as a centralized, militarily formidable, and diplomatically astute power. The political, military, and economic foundations he established created a platform from which Macedon could project influence beyond the Greek peninsula. His death later that year did not undo these achievements. Instead, it prepared the way for the next generation to transform regional dominance into global ambition. His son would turn that unity outward toward empire. Educated by Aristotle, crowned by ambition, Alexander inherited a world ready to change. Alexander III of Macedon, later known as Alexander the Great, was born in 356 BCE to King Philip II and Queen Olympias. From an early age, he was immersed in the political and military culture of Macedon, observing firsthand the consolidation of power that had transformed his kingdom into the dominant force in Greece. His upbringing combined aristocratic privilege with rigorous exposure to military organization, governance, and court politics, preparing him to assume command in a highly competitive and often violent environment. A central component of Alexander's formation was his education under Aristotle, one of the foremost philosophers of the Greek world. Between approximately 343 and 340 BCE, Aristotle instructed Alexander in philosophy, science, medicine, and literature, fostering a rational and analytical approach to understanding human affairs, nature, and governance. Aristotle's influence extended to ethics, political theory, and the strategic importance of knowledge for leadership. Surviving texts and later accounts by authors such as Plutarch and Arrian emphasize that Alexander's lifelong curiosity, systematic approach to problems, and appreciation of Greek culture were shaped during this formative period. Alexander also gained early practical experience in military command. By his late teens, he led contingents of the Macedonian army in campaigns against rebellious tribes and external threats, demonstrating skill in logistics, strategy, and battlefield leadership. These engagements provided the young prince with first-hand insight into the strengths and limitations of combined arms tactics, the importance of terrain, and the coordination of infantry and cavalry, all elements critical to Macedon's recent successes under Philip II. Epigraphic and archaeological evidence from Macedonian fortifications and battle sites corroborates the scale of operations during this period, illustrating the practical training that complemented his theoretical instruction. The assassination of Philip II in 336 BCE created an immediate succession crisis. Alexander, then 20 years old, swiftly consolidated his claim to the throne, neutralizing potential rivals within the royal family and Macedonian nobility. Ancient sources, including Diodorus Siculus and Justin, detail the rapid suppression of revolts in Thrace, Illyria, and other Macedonian territories, demonstrating his decisive use of both diplomacy and military force to stabilize the kingdom. His ability to command loyalty from both veteran officers and newly appointed leaders reflected the effectiveness of Macedon's institutional and military framework established under Philip. Alexander's early policies combined continuity with innovation. He preserved the administrative and fiscal systems implemented by his father while asserting personal authority over the army and key political structures. By maintaining Macedonian cohesion, he ensured that the state was prepared for both internal security and external expansion. Coins, inscriptions, and administrative decrees from this period indicate the consolidation of royal authority and the continuity of Macedonian governance practices, emphasizing both stability and centralization. Strategically, Alexander inherited a Greece united under Macedonian hegemony but still populated by autonomous city-states. His succession occurred against a backdrop of political fragility among southern polis and unrest in peripheral regions. Understanding both the advantages and limitations of Macedonian power, he combined swift military action with diplomatic engagement, securing loyalty from critical allies and preemptively addressing potential rebellions. This approach reflects a systematic understanding of power projection and statecraft, demonstrating that Alexander's early rule was as much an exercise in political engineering as it was a preparation for future conquest. Alexander's early years, therefore, reveal the convergence of education, military practice, and political acumen. The intellectual foundation provided by Aristotle, combined with practical battlefield experience and exposure to Macedonian statecraft, created a leader uniquely equipped to exploit both inherited structures and emergent opportunities. His personal ambition, reinforced by rigorous preparation, would soon translate inherited unity into expansive military campaigns. By the end of 336 BCE, Alexander had stabilized Macedon, secured loyalty from his army and key allies, and assumed full control of the kingdom. He inherited not only a unified Greek world under Macedonian oversight but also a state capable of sustaining ambitious campaigns of conquest. These early experiences set the stage for his unprecedented expansion across Persia and beyond, demonstrating the interplay of preparation, inherited structures, and personal initiative in shaping historical trajectories. In less than a decade, he would conquer it. From the Hellespont to Babylon, a single army reshaped the ancient world. Alexander III of Macedon commenced his campaign against the Persian Empire in 334 BCE, crossing the Hellespont with an army of approximately 35,000 men, including phalanx infantry, heavy cavalry, light infantry, and allied contingents. The initial objective was Asia Minor, a region under Persian satrapal control but recently destabilized by internal revolts and discontent. Alexander's forces relied on combined arms tactics developed under Philip II, emphasizing the coordination of the Tsar-Isa phalanx, cavalry maneuvers, and flexible use of light infantry to exploit terrain. Contemporary sources, particularly Arrian and Diodorus Siculus, describe the meticulous planning, logistics, and intelligence preparation that underpin the campaign. Archaeological surveys of Granicus River battlefields corroborate troop deployments and strategies, confirming historical accounts of Macedonian tactical innovation. The Battle of the Granicus River marked the first major engagement. Persian satraps deployed cavalry along the riverbanks, aiming to leverage numerical superiority and control of key crossing points. Alexander executed a rapid offensive, personally leading the companion cavalry in a decisive charge against Persian command elements. The engagement demonstrated the effectiveness of leadership at the front, the cohesion of the phalanx under pressure, and the integration of cavalry and infantry in a coordinated assault. The victory secured coastal cities along the Aegean and reinforced Alexander's control of western Asia Minor, providing a secure base for further operations. In 333 BCE, Alexander advanced into southern Anatolia and Cilicia, culminating in the Battle of Issus. Persian King Darius III personally led an army far larger than Alexander's, including infantry, cavalry, and war chariots. Alexander exploited terrain constraints, forcing the Persian army into a narrow corridor that neutralized their numerical advantage. Macedonian phalanx formations engaged in frontal assaults while cavalry maneuvered to threaten the Persian flanks. The collapse of Darius' line, followed by his flight from the battlefield, decisively ended Persian control in the region. Contemporary inscriptions and archaeological evidence of battlefield positions, coupled with coinage and local records, support accounts of Macedonian strategy and logistical organization. Following Issus, Alexander secured coastal cities and key ports, consolidating supply lines and ensuring access to naval resources. The systematic capture of fortified settlements, including Tyre and Gaza, illustrates his strategic integration of siegecraft, naval coordination, and urban operations. The fall of these cities further disrupted Persian administrative structures and morale, demonstrating that conquest relied as much on logistical and political control as on battlefield victory. Evidence from siege remains and maritime archaeology confirms the scale and complexity of these operations, highlighting Alexander's comprehensive approach to empire building. The Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE represented the culmination of the Persian campaign. Darius assembled a vast army with infantry, cavalry, and chariots, deploying in a wide, open formation designed to envelop Macedonian forces. Alexander utilized an oblique phalanx advance, supported by cavalry flanking maneuvers, and exploited gaps in the Persian deployment to strike decisively at the center. Darius' retreat once again caused the collapse of Persian cohesion, allowing Alexander to capture Babylon and subsequently Susa and Persepolis, the latter symbolic as the ceremonial heart of the empire. Archaeological evidence, including ruins of palatial complexes and city layouts, aligns with classical sources, confirming the scope of territorial control and administrative reorganization following conquest. Alexander's success was not merely military. It depended on logistical planning and administrative foresight. Supply chains, local alliances, and integration of conquered territories into Macedonian governance ensured that rapid advances did not overextend the army. Tribute, coinage, and regional governors maintained stability, while incorporation of local elites facilitated continuity and minimized rebellion. Epigraphic records from Asia Minor and Mesopotamia corroborate these measures, demonstrating the systemic nature of conquest and the balance between force and governance. Analytically, the campaign illustrates the interplay of tactics, leadership, and systemic planning. Macedonian innovation, combined with disciplined execution, enabled a numerically inferior army to defeat the largest empire in the known world. Alexander's approach integrated battlefield innovation, siegecraft, and administrative consolidation, reflecting an understanding that lasting conquest requires both military prowess and political infrastructure. These principles defined his expansion and established the foundations for subsequent Hellenistic governance. By 330 BCE, with Persia effectively dismantled and major urban centers under control, Alexander had achieved an unprecedented degree of territorial domination. The campaign demonstrated the combination of personal leadership, innovative military doctrine, and systematic administration capable of reshaping the geopolitical landscape. Yet, victory also introduced new questions of governance, succession, and cultural integration, challenges that would define the next phase of his empire. Victory, however, raised a new question: what would follow conquest? At the edge of the world, Alexander met not defeat, but human limits. After consolidating control over Persia, Alexander turned eastward, aiming to extend Macedonian influence into Bactria, Sogdiana, and the Indian subcontinent. From 329 to 326 BCE, he advanced through harsh and unfamiliar terrain, engaging in campaigns that tested both logistical planning and human endurance. The Macedonian army, experienced yet increasingly fatigued, confronted difficult mountain passes, monsoon climates, and complex political landscapes dominated by local kings and tribal confederations. Contemporary sources, including Arrian and Curtius Rufus, highlight both the military ingenuity of Alexander and the mounting strain on his forces. Archaeological surveys of fortifications and battle sites in Bactria and the Punjab corroborate the historical record of sustained, organized campaigns across diverse environments. In Bactria and Sogdiana, Alexander faced guerrilla resistance, fortified hill settlements, and strategically dispersed populations. His approach combines siegecraft, psychological warfare, and incorporation of local forces into the Macedonian army. Cities such as Marikanda, modern Samarkand, and Alexandria Eskate were established as administrative centers to consolidate territorial control and facilitate supply lines. Epigraphic evidence, Coinage and urban planning patterns from these regions indicate a systematic effort to integrate conquered populations while projecting Macedonian authority. By 326 BCE, Alexander reached the Indus River, confronting the kingdoms of northern India, including the forces of King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes. Despite facing war elephants and unfamiliar terrain, Alexander employed coordinated cavalry charges, phalanx maneuvers, and tactical feints to achieve a decisive victory. Porus' subsequent submission and retention of local authority under Macedonian oversight reflect Alexander's combination of military force and pragmatic governance. Numismatic and epigraphic records in the Punjab suggest that he established administrative structures that preserved local traditions while securing Macedonian influence. The advance into India revealed both the limits of conquest and the importance of logistics, morale, and human endurance. Alexander's army, stretched across vast distances and confronting unfamiliar climates, experienced exhaustion, declining morale, and dissent. In 326 BCE, at the Hyphasis River, modern Bias, his troops refused to march further east, compelling Alexander to turn southward along the Indian subcontinent. The decision illustrates the systemic constraint of human resources on expansion, demonstrating that even unprecedented leadership and strategic brilliance are bounded by physical and psychological realities. The return journey through the Gadrosian Desert, modern Baluchistan, further tested the army. Extreme heat, limited water sources, and harsh terrain caused substantial casualties, illustrating the vulnerability of extended supply chains in hostile environments. Alexander's planning mitigated some risks through prepositioned supplies and local support, but the campaign emphasized the interaction of geography, logistics, and human limits in constraining empire building. Archaeological evidence of settlements, caravan routes, and fortifications along this corridor provides corroboration of the strategic challenges faced during the retreat. Analytically, the Eastern campaigns highlight a key principle of empire. Expansion is as dependent on human endurance and logistical infrastructure as it is on military innovation and leadership. Alexander's victories in Bactria and India extended Macedonian power to unprecedented boundaries, yet the limits encountered underscore the constraints of early state and army systems in sustaining prolonged overseas operations. The campaigns combined tactical brilliance, engineering ingenuity, and strategic foresight, but ultimately relied on the resilience and compliance of human forces. By the time Alexander returned to Babylon in 323 BCE, his empire stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, encompassing diverse peoples, cultures, and political systems. Yet the conquest left unresolved challenges of administration, succession, and integration. The army's exhaustion, combined with regional diversity and the absence of a clearly designated heir, created structural vulnerabilities that would define the empire's immediate post-Alexandrian trajectory. When he died in Babylon, the empire he built had no heir. The man who united the known world left it divided once more. In 323 BCE, Alexander the Great died in Babylon at the age of 32, leaving an empire that spanned from Greece to the Indus. The circumstances of his death remain debated, with sources citing fever, possible malaria, or typhoid, though some accounts suggest political intrigue. Regardless of cause, his passing precipitated an immediate succession crisis, as he had left no adult heir capable of assuming authority. His wife Roxana was pregnant, and his half-brother Aridaeus, later Philip III, was deemed mentally unfit for independent rule. Contemporary chronicles, including those of Arrian and Diodorus, describe the uncertainty and tension among Macedonian generals and administrators in the immediate aftermath. The absence of a clear succession plan led to a fragmentation of authority. Alexander's generals, collectively known as the Diadochi, assumed regional control, each consolidating power in strategically important provinces. Ptolemy took Egypt, Seleucus secured the eastern territories of Persia, Antigonus controlled Asia Minor, and Lysimachus gained Thrace. Initial arrangements, formalized through compromise and temporary agreements, quickly gave way to competition as the generals pursued personal ambition. Epigraphic evidence, inscriptions, and surviving administrative records indicate that these arrangements were often provisional, reflecting both the complexity of governing such a vast domain and the centrifugal forces unleashed by Alexander's sudden death. The ensuing wars of the Diadochi, 322 to 275 BCE, involved repeated military engagements, shifting alliances, and strategic maneuvers across the former empire. Battles at Ipsus, Gabiene, and other key sites determined the eventual division of territories, while diplomatic marriages and hostage exchanges served as instruments of negotiation. Archaeological surveys of fortifications and battlefield remains across Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia confirm the scale and intensity of these conflicts, illustrating the combination of conventional and siege warfare used to consolidate power. These wars resulted in the permanent division of Alexander's empire into Hellenistic kingdoms. The primary successor states, Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, and Antigonid Macedon, maintained Greek-style administration, military organization, and cultural practices, yet operated independently. This fragmentation underscored the structural limitations of Alexander's conquests. While his campaigns had united diverse regions under a single ruler, they did not create sustainable mechanisms for centralized governance over such extensive and heterogeneous territories. The empire's collapse into separate dynasties demonstrates the interplay of geography, communication constraints, and the reliance on charismatic leadership in sustaining early empires. The political vacuum also had broader consequences for the Greek world. City-states that had been subordinated under Macedonian hegemony regained degrees of autonomy or came under new dynastic control. The Hellenistic kingdoms became centers of military innovation, cultural exchange, and economic integration, inheriting Alexander's model of combining Greek administrative forms with local institutions. Epigraphic, numismatic, and architectural evidence from these regions illustrates the diffusion of Greek culture, governance, and urban planning, even as political unity remained fractured. Analytically, Alexander's death illustrates a central principle of empire. Conquest alone does not guarantee lasting political cohesion. The success of expansion depended heavily on personal authority, disciplined military structures, and administrative oversight. Without a designated successor capable of commanding loyalty and coordinating governance across vast distances, the empire fragmented along regional, cultural, and military lines. The wars of the Diadochi exemplify how structural vulnerabilities and human ambition interact to reshape political landscapes rapidly after the death of a centralizing figure. By 320 BCE, the former Macedonian Empire had been divided into multiple Hellenistic kingdoms, each ruled by former generals and their descendants. While Alexander's military achievements ensured Greek cultural influence across 3 continents, his political structure could not endure without his direct leadership. These developments set the stage for the Hellenistic Age, a period in which Greek culture, political experimentation, and intercultural interaction flourished across a divided yet interconnected world. From these divisions arose a new order, the Hellenistic Age. 3 kingdoms carried Greece's legacy beyond its homeland. Following the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE, his empire fractured into multiple successor kingdoms, each ruled by one of his former generals, or diadochi. The 3 most enduring and influential dynasties were the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Asia, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedon. Each adapted Macedonian military organization and Greek administrative models to local conditions, balancing Greek cultural forms with regional traditions, and serving as the primary carriers of Hellenistic influence across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The Ptolemies, beginning with Ptolemy Isoter, established their capital at Alexandria, a city founded by Alexander himself. Alexandria became the political, economic, and cultural center of Ptolemaic Egypt, integrating Greek-style administration with existing Egyptian bureaucratic systems. The dynasty emphasized stability and centralization, using Greek and native officials to manage taxation, grain production, and trade. Ptolemaic patronage of learning and the arts, including the construction of the Library of Alexandria and the Mouseion, reinforced Greek intellectual traditions while facilitating cross-cultural scholarship. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions, coinage, and monumental architecture, supports the integration of Hellenistic and Egyptian practices under Ptolemaic rule. The Seleucid Empire, founded by Seleucus I Nicator, encompassed vast territories from Anatolia and Syria to Mesopotamia and parts of India. Maintaining control over such diverse lands required sophisticated administrative systems, including provincial satrapies, garrison cities, and military colonies. The Seleucids promoted Greek urbanism, establishing cities like Seleucia on the Tigris, which served as centers of commerce, Hellenistic culture, and military oversight. Inscriptions, urban layouts, and numismatic evidence indicate efforts to impose Greek language, law, and civic institutions while accommodating local elites to ensure loyalty. The Seleucid approach illustrates the necessity of adaptive governance in maintaining authority over heterogeneous populations. The Antigonid dynasty in Macedon, though smaller geographically, remained politically and militarily significant in Greece. Antigonid kings maintained control over Macedonia and, intermittently, influence in southern Greece, balancing military strength with diplomacy to manage rival city-states. Their administration relied on central taxation, local magistrates, and a disciplined army, preserving the Macedonian military traditions established under Philip II and Alexander. Epigraphic evidence demonstrates the integration of Greek civic and royal structures, reinforcing continuity in governance while asserting dynastic authority. Despite differences in scale and environment, all three dynasties shared common strategies for consolidating power. Military organization, based on Macedonian phalanx infantry, cavalry, and mercenary forces, provided internal security and deterrence against external threats. Urban foundations and the promotion of Greek cultural institutions helped legitimize authority and facilitate cultural cohesion among Greek settlers and local populations. Coinage, monumental architecture, and administrative documents served as instruments of both practical governance and ideological projection, communicating legitimacy, economic stability, and Hellenistic identity. Analytically, the successor kingdoms exemplify the interaction between inherited military structures and adaptive governance. Each dynasty relied on the Macedonian model of centralized authority, professional armies, and elite patronage, but tailored these systems to the social, economic, and geographic contexts of their territories. The Ptolemies integrated Greek and Egyptian bureaucratic traditions. The Seleucids balanced vast territorial control with local autonomy, and the Antigonids maintained continuity within the Macedonian heartland. These strategies ensured both survival and cultural influence, even as political fragmentation persisted. Cultural policies were central to the dynasty's strategy. Greek language, civic institutions, art, and education were systematically promoted, often in conjunction with local religious and cultural practices. Festivals, temples, and public works reinforced Greek identity while accommodating regional traditions. Epigraphic and archaeological evidence across Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Macedonia indicates the deliberate dissemination of Hellenistic culture, creating a cosmopolitan elite that connected Greek settlers, local populations, and administrative officials. This cultural integration facilitated trade, intellectual exchange, and cohesion within diverse empires. Economically, the successor kingdoms controlled critical trade networks connecting the Mediterranean, Near East, and India. Ptolemaic Egypt managed grain supplies that sustained cities across the eastern Mediterranean. Seleucid territories facilitated overland trade along the Silk Road, and Antigonid Macedon remained a regional hub for commerce and military logistics. The integration of economic management with administrative oversight allowed these kingdoms to sustain military, political, and cultural projects over generations, highlighting the systemic interdependence of governance, military capacity, and economic control in Hellenistic statecraft. By the end of the 3rd century BCE, the successor kingdoms had established durable political and cultural frameworks, ensuring the spread and persistence of Greek influence far beyond the traditional homeland. While no single state achieved the territorial scale of Alexander's empire, collectively they maintained Hellenistic civilization across 3 continents, demonstrating the resilience and adaptability of Greek institutional models in diverse environments. In this cosmopolitan age, Greek culture became a world language. In the libraries and laboratories of Alexandria, Greece became universal. The Hellenistic period fostered unprecedented developments in science, philosophy, and cross-cultural exchange, particularly centered on the intellectual hubs of Alexandria, Pergamon, and other major cities. Alexandria, founded by Alexander and established as the Ptolemaic capital, became the preeminent center of learning in the Mediterranean. The Library of Alexandria and the associated Mouseion functioned as systematic repositories of knowledge, drawing scholars from across the Hellenistic world to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy. Papyrus manuscripts, inscriptions, and references in later classical sources attest to the scale and organization of this intellectual infrastructure. Mathematics flourished under figures such as Euclid, whose elements codified geometric principles into a deductive system that remained foundational for centuries. Archimedes of Syracuse combined mathematical theory with practical engineering, designing war machines, water-lifting devices, and mechanisms based on principles of leverage and buoyancy. Their work exemplifies the integration of abstract reasoning with applied technology, reflecting a systematic approach to understanding and manipulating the natural world. Archaeological evidence, including remnants of mechanical devices, surveying instruments, and mathematical papyri, supports the sophistication of these endeavors. Hellenistic philosophy similarly evolved, addressing ethical, epistemological, and metaphysical questions in ways that resonated across cultures. Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium, emphasized rational self-control, virtue, and harmony with natural law, influencing civic and personal conduct throughout the Mediterranean. Epicureanism, originating with Epicurus in Athens, advocated the pursuit of pleasure understood as the absence of pain, alongside communal and intellectual engagement. Both schools relied on Greek language, textual transmission, and rhetorical methods, yet adapted to cosmopolitan audiences in multi-ethnic cities. Evidence from papyri, inscriptions, and surviving treatises illustrates both the dissemination and localized adaptation of these philosophical systems. The Hellenistic era was also defined by cultural fusion. Greek settlers and local populations in Egypt, Persia, and Central Asia engaged in sustained exchange of religious, artistic, and administrative practices. Egyptian deities were syncretized with Greek gods, as in the cult of Serapis, while Persian ceremonial traditions influenced royal court protocols. Artistic motifs, architectural styles, and urban planning combined Hellenistic and indigenous elements, producing hybrid forms evident in sculpture, coinage, and monumental architecture. Archaeological surveys in cities such as Alexandria, Antioch, and Ai Khanium reveal the systematic blending of Greek urban layouts with local materials and decorative styles, reflecting deliberate cultural integration. Science and engineering benefited from these cross-cultural interactions. Astronomical observations, medical texts, and technical treatises incorporated knowledge from Babylonia, Egypt, and India, expanding the scope of empirical study. Figures like Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth using observations from multiple latitudes, demonstrating sophisticated application of geometry and measurement. Medical scholars, drawing on Greek and Egyptian traditions, advanced anatomical understanding and pharmacology. These developments underscore the Hellenistic synthesis of observation, reasoning, and practical application, establishing enduring intellectual legacies. Economically, the diffusion of knowledge was supported by cosmopolitan trade networks. Maritime routes connecting the Eastern Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Persian Gulf facilitated movement of manuscripts, instruments, and ideas, while urban centers provided the infrastructure for scholarly exchange. Libraries, lecture halls, and academies functioned as nodes within a broader system of intellectual circulation, integrating teaching, research, and publication in ways that anticipated later institutional scholarship. Coins, inscriptions, and transport records demonstrate the material foundations that enabled this cross-cultural intellectual economy. Analytically, the period illustrates the interdependence of cultural exchange, institutional infrastructure, and intellectual innovation. Greek methods of reasoning, civic organization, and artistic representation were adapted and extended through interaction with local traditions, producing hybrid forms that spread across multiple regions. The systematic promotion of scholarship by Hellenistic rulers not only enhanced political legitimacy but also facilitated practical problem-solving, from urban engineering to navigation and military logistics. This convergence of administration, culture, and scientific inquiry exemplifies the broader systemic forces shaping the Hellenistic world. By the 2nd century BCE, Hellenistic cities functioned as intellectual and cultural universes, integrating Greek and local traditions across architecture, philosophy, and science. Greek language and modes of thought became universal within the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, influencing subsequent Roman governance, education, and scientific inquiry. These achievements, while rooted in the political structures established by the successor kingdoms, transcended dynastic boundaries, creating enduring frameworks for knowledge and cultural identity. Yet while ideas flourished, political power shifted westward. Greece lost its freedom but conquered Rome with its mind. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the Hellenistic kingdoms faced increasing pressure from Rome, which had expanded steadily throughout the Italian peninsula and into the eastern Mediterranean. Macedon, under the Antigonid kings, attempted to assert influence over Greece and maintain regional dominance, but successive conflicts with Rome undermined its authority. The Macedonian Wars, 214 to 148 BCE, demonstrated the strategic and military superiority of the Roman legions, culminating in the decisive defeat of King Perseus at Pydna in 168 BCE. Contemporary historians, including Polybius, detail how Roman organization, discipline, and logistical capacity overcame Macedonian phalanx formations, signaling the shift of hegemony from Hellenistic kings to Rome. Following Macedon's defeat, the Greek city-states, long accustomed to autonomy or semi-independence under Hellenistic dynasties, faced direct Roman intervention. In 146 BCE, the city of Corinth was besieged and destroyed by the Romans after a rebellion against their authority. This event marked a turning point, demonstrating the consequences of resistance and the effectiveness of Roman military strategy. Archaeological excavations at Corinth reveal the scale of destruction, including city walls breached by siege engines, charred remains of public buildings, and layers of debris indicative of systematic conquest. The annexation of Corinth symbolically and practically ended the independence of the classical Greek polis. Greece was subsequently incorporated into the Roman sphere, organized as the province of Achaea in 146 BCE. Roman administration maintained urban infrastructure, taxation, and local magistracies, while integrating Greek cities into imperial networks of commerce, law, and governance. Coinage, inscriptions, and legal documents from the period reflect the blending of Greek civic practices with Roman provincial oversight. While political autonomy was curtailed, local cultural, religious, and educational institutions continued to thrive under Roman supervision, illustrating the resilience of Greek traditions despite loss of sovereignty. Culturally, Greek influence persisted and expanded within the Roman world. Greek literature, philosophy, science, and artistic styles became central to Roman education and intellectual life. Greek tutors, scholars, and architects were highly valued in Rome, facilitating the transmission of Hellenistic knowledge across the empire. Philosophical schools, particularly Stoicism and Epicureanism, informed Roman political thought, rhetoric, and personal ethics. This intellectual dominance underscores the distinction between political subjugation and cultural influence, demonstrating that Greek achievements continued to shape the Mediterranean long after the end of political independence. Analytically, the Roman conquest illustrates the systemic interplay between military capacity, administrative efficiency, and political integration. While Hellenistic kingdoms retained considerable cultural and economic resources, they lacked the organizational cohesion and sustained military discipline that Rome demonstrated. The integration of Greece into the Roman provincial system highlights the enduring value of Greek urban, educational, and cultural structures, which Rome both exploited and perpetuated. The transition from independent city-states to provincial status reflects the broader pattern of power consolidation in the ancient world, where centralized empires absorbed smaller polities while appropriating their intellectual and cultural capital. By 146 BCE, Greece had lost political autonomy, yet its intellectual, artistic, and philosophical traditions were more influential than ever. Greek language became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. Hellenistic science and mathematics were studied in Roman centers of learning, and classical art and architecture shaped public and private life across the empire. In this sense, while Rome conquered Greece militarily, it inherited and propagated Greek civilization, ensuring the enduring legacy of Hellenic culture within the broader Mediterranean world. Thus ended the age of the city-states, but not the legacy of Greece. Centuries after the polis fell, its ideas still governed empires. The intellectual and political innovations of ancient Greece exerted a profound and lasting influence on subsequent civilizations. Greek notions of citizenship, law, and governance, particularly as developed in the Athenian polis, provided foundational models for later republican and civic systems. Concepts of deliberative assemblies, codified law, and participatory government were studied, adapted, and incorporated by Roman institutions, influencing both the Roman Republic and later European political thought. Aristotle's Politics and Plato's Republic provided analytical frameworks for understanding the organization of the state, the role of the citizen, and the principles of justice. Surviving manuscripts, commentaries, and references from Roman authors, such as Cicero, demonstrate the transmission of Greek political philosophy into Latin discourse and administration. Greek philosophy, extending beyond politics, established enduring modes of rational inquiry and ethical reflection. Socratic dialogue and Aristotelian logic emphasized systematic reasoning, observation, and debate, forming the basis for methods of argumentation and scientific investigation in later eras. The works of Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, developed during the Hellenistic period, influenced Roman moral thought, civic ethics, and personal conduct, with epigraphic evidence of philosophical schools and lecture circles present in Roman urban centers. This philosophical inheritance persisted into the late antique and medieval periods, where Greek texts, often translated into Latin or Arabic, informed scholasticism, Islamic philosophy, and Renaissance humanism. Education in particular relied on Greek intellectual foundations. Grammar, rhetoric, mathematics, and philosophy were taught according to Hellenistic curricula adapted for Roman and Byzantine contexts. Libraries, lecture halls, and private tutoring preserved Greek methods of learning, ensuring that classical texts remained central to elite education. Manuscripts preserved in monastic libraries and later rediscovered during the Renaissance reflect the systematic continuity of Greek scholarship. Aristotle's treatises on natural science, metaphysics, and ethics, alongside Platonic and Hellenistic works, informed both empirical inquiry and theoretical reasoning, establishing a framework for centuries of intellectual development. Greek legal and political thought also provided conceptual tools for understanding justice, civic duty, and governance. The codification of laws in Athens, the institutionalization of democratic practices, and debates over constitutional design influenced Roman legal theory and, much later, Enlightenment thinkers. The philosophical emphasis on reasoned debate and civic responsibility, articulated through texts and public discourse, reinforced the integration of Greek ideas into Roman educational, political, and administrative culture. Archaeological evidence of inscriptions, civic decrees, and epigraphic records demonstrates the practical implementation of these principles, which continued to shape civic life beyond the Hellenistic era. Analytically, the survival of Greek political and philosophical frameworks illustrates the interaction between intellectual rigor and institutional transmission. Even as military and political power shifted to Rome and later states, Greek ideas provided enduring methods for organizing society, analyzing ethical dilemmas, and cultivating rational inquiry. These intellectual legacies reveal the capacity of thought to persist independently of immediate political control, demonstrating how systemic ideas, codified practices, and textual preservation can extend influence across temporal and geographical boundaries. By the early Roman Empire, Greek philosophy and political theory were deeply embedded in elite education and governance. Prominent Roman figures, including Cicero, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, engaged directly with Greek thought, producing texts that synthesized Hellenic ideas with Roman civic and ethical frameworks. This cross-cultural intellectual inheritance ensured that, centuries after the collapse of independent city-states, Greek principles remained active in shaping conceptions of law, governance, and rational inquiry, establishing a durable and widespread legacy across the Mediterranean world and beyond. Just as thought endured, so too did art and architecture. In marble and manuscript, Greece never truly died. Greek artistic and architectural achievements exerted a profound influence on the Mediterranean and, ultimately, global cultural history. From the classical period onward, Greek sculpture, pottery, and architectural design established standards of proportion, harmony, and realism that would inform generations of creators. Temples such as the Parthenon in Athens, with its Doric and Ionic elements, became paradigms for architectural order, symmetry, and decorative articulation. Archaeological studies of column orders, entablatures, and sculptural reliefs reveal the precision and engineering knowledge embedded in Greek structures, demonstrating a synthesis of aesthetic ideals and practical construction techniques. Greek sculpture similarly established principles of naturalism, anatomical precision, and expressive representation. Artists such as Phidias and Polykleitos codified proportions and techniques, influencing Roman statuary, portraiture, and public monuments. Roman copies and adaptations preserved Greek originals, creating a continuous visual tradition that extended into the Renaissance. The use of perspective, balance, and idealized form in Hellenistic sculpture further expanded the expressive range of art, producing works that emphasize dynamism, emotion, and narrative, evident in surviving reliefs and statuary across Mediterranean collections. The transmission of Greek artistic ideals was closely linked to cultural exchange and text preservation. Treatises on architecture, such as those later compiled in Vitruvius de Architectura, codified Hellenistic knowledge for Roman architects, while literary and philosophical texts preserved Greek aesthetic principles. Manuscripts of Greek rhetoric, poetry, and drama circulated across the Roman world, providing intellectual and visual frameworks that shaped cultural production. These texts, often copied in libraries or scriptoria, ensured that Greek artistic norms persisted through centuries, influencing Renaissance artists such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael, who studied both proportion and anatomical models rooted in classical antiquity. Greek influence extended beyond formal art and architecture to urban planning and civic design. Hellenistic city layouts, incorporating orthogonal street grids, public agoras, theaters, and temples, informed Roman urban development and, subsequently, European city planning. Archaeological surveys in cities like Alexandria, Pergamon, and Ephesus reveal systematic integration of public spaces, monuments, and civic institutions, demonstrating the transfer of Greek urbanistic concepts across diverse regions. This urban framework, transmitted through both text and observation, shaped the visual and functional organization of later cities throughout the Mediterranean and European contexts. Analytically, the endurance of Greek art and architecture illustrates the interdependence of visual culture, textual transmission, and institutional replication. By codifying aesthetic principles, training artists and architects, and disseminating designs through practical application and textual records, Greek civilization established durable cultural norms. These norms were adaptable, influencing societies with different languages, religions, and political systems, yet preserving core principles of proportion, balance, and expressive clarity. The survival and adaptation of Greek artistic ideals underscore the capacity of visual and intellectual culture to transcend temporal and geographic boundaries. Moreover, Greek artistic heritage facilitated the fusion of cultural traditions in the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. Sculpture, pottery, and architectural motifs were combined with Egyptian, Persian, and local styles, producing hybrid forms that retained Greek principles while engaging regional tastes. Coins, reliefs, and civic monuments display these blended influences, demonstrating how Greek aesthetics could function as both an idealized model and a flexible system for intercultural expression. This adaptability contributed to the long-term survival and relevance of Greek art across epochs. By the Renaissance, Greek visual and intellectual legacies had been recovered through manuscripts, archaeological observation, and textual scholarship. Artists and architects looked to Greek models as benchmarks for perfection, harmony, and humanistic expression, ensuring the continuity of classical aesthetics into modern times. Through museums, libraries, and educational institutions, these ideals remain accessible, shaping contemporary understandings of proportion, form, and civic design. Its intellectual spirit, too, remains the foundation of inquiry. Modern science continues to uncover the real Greece beneath the ideal. The study of ancient Greece underwent a systematic transformation between the 18th and 20th centuries, as European scholars, travelers, and archaeologists began to explore its ruins with scientific rigor. Early travelers such as Pausanias' textual successors documented temples, inscriptions, and landscapes, providing descriptive accounts that guided subsequent excavation. The development of philology, epigraphy, and classical studies established methodological standards for interpreting texts and artifacts, allowing scholars to reconstruct Greek history with greater precision. These efforts marked the emergence of Hellenic studies as a formal academic discipline. Archaeology became central to understanding Greek civilization. Excavations at Delphi, Olympia, Knossos, and the Athenian Agora revealed monumental architecture, urban layouts, and everyday material culture, offering insights unattainable from literary sources alone. Stratigraphic methods, typological analysis of pottery, and the study of inscriptions enabled the reconstruction of chronological sequences, political structures, and social organization. For example, the recovery of linear B tablets at Pylos and Knossos clarified administrative practices and literacy in the Mycenaean world, confirming and expanding upon prior historical reconstructions. Material culture studies, including sculpture, coins, and tools, have provided evidence for economic networks, artistic development, and technological innovation, complementing textual analysis. The 19th and 20th centuries saw the establishment of systematic excavation programs, often under the auspices of national archaeological institutes. German, British, and American teams systematically surveyed and restored sites, producing detailed architectural plans, photographic records, and comprehensive artifact catalogs. Discoveries at sites such as the Acropolis of Athens, the Sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia, and the theater complexes of Epidaurus offered empirical confirmation of classical literary descriptions while revealing previously unknown aspects of civic, religious, and cultural life. Such excavations demonstrated the integration of architectural, epigraphic, and artistic evidence in reconstructing Greek society and its institutions. Scholarly interpretation has evolved alongside these discoveries. Classical historians, philologists, and archaeologists now approach Greek antiquity through interdisciplinary frameworks, combining textual criticism, material culture studies, and environmental analysis. Research on ancient trade networks, hydraulic engineering, and urban planning highlights the interplay of geography, economy, and social organization in shaping Greek civilization. Current debates examine the socio-political roles of women, slaves, and non-elite populations, reflecting a nuanced understanding of systemic structures beyond elite political narratives. Modern technological advancements have expanded the scope of Greek scholarship. Remote sensing, GIS mapping, and 3D modeling allow archaeologists to visualize ancient settlements, reconstruct architectural complexes, and analyze spatial relationships within urban and rural landscapes. These methods have provided new insights into fortifications, water management systems, and city planning, emphasizing the integration of environmental adaptation and human engineering in Greek settlements. Additionally, isotope analysis, paleobotanical studies, and epigraphic digitization offer refined data on diet, economy, and literacy, enabling historians to quantify previously qualitative aspects of Greek life. The rediscovery of Greece has not been limited to material culture. Manuscript recovery, preservation, and critical editions of classical texts have allowed scholars to reconstruct lost literary traditions and refine chronologies. Works by Homer, Herodotus, Thucydides, Plato, and Aristotle continue to be analyzed in light of archaeological evidence, bridging textual and material dimensions of historical inquiry. This synthesis demonstrates the enduring methodological principle that understanding Greece requires both artifacts and written records, each contextualized within its historical, social, and geographical setting. Analytically, modern scholarship illustrates the persistence of Greek inquiry and systematic reasoning, echoing the intellectual legacy of the civilization itself. The methods used to uncover, interpret, and disseminate knowledge about Greece reflect the same combination of observation, critical evaluation, and synthesis that characterized Greek philosophy, science, and historiography. Archaeology, textual studies, and technological innovation collectively demonstrate how empirical evidence can reshape historical understanding, providing an evolving picture of Greece that balances idealized literary images with material reality. By the 21st century, the frontiers of Hellenic research continue to expand. Ongoing excavations in Crete, Macedonia, and Asia Minor, combined with digital humanities projects, allow scholars to revisit classical assumptions and uncover new dimensions of Greek political, cultural, and scientific achievement. These efforts ensure that the study of ancient Greece remains dynamic, rigorous, and deeply connected to the intellectual spirit of the civilization itself. From myth to method, the study of Greece reflects the endurance of its quest for knowledge. If you found this journey through ancient Greece illuminating, consider subscribing to our channel to explore more long-form, research-driven historical documentaries. Dive deeper into the civilizations that shaped our world, and join a community dedicated to clarity, accuracy, and the timeless stories of human history. Don't forget to like, share, and comment with the civilization you'd like us to explore next. Your curiosity drives the next chapter of our historical adventure.